The Wassail Wager by Catherine Bilson. Narrated by Catherine Bilson. Chapter 1.
Evadne Rose!
It was a piercing shriek, echoing off the walls of the townhouse, arresting Evie in her tracks as she attempted to creep up the stairs. "I think your mother knows you're home, Miss Evie," the butler said, in a typically massive understatement. "Yes, thank you, Goatley," Evie said on a sigh, abandoning her attempt to sneak up the stairs and heading for the door to the parlour. "Would you have tea and cake sent in, please?" "I'm not sure tea and cake will soothe Mrs. Hallidan's temper, Miss Evie, but of course." The kindly butler, who had known Evie her entire life, gave her a gently admonishing glance as he opened the parlour door for her. "You've really done it this time, Miss Evie," he murmured quietly as she walked past him. "Best be prepared to grovel." Grovelling was very much not in Evie's nature.
Gambling!
Mrs. Hallidan cried, throwing her hands up in the air.
On a horse race? Oh, Evadne, what were you thinking?
"I was thinking that Lord Dunallen's grey was clearly the faster animal, and it was quite inexplicable that everyone was backing Mr. Hyton's chestnut," Evie muttered under her breath. And I was right. She had the 5 guineas in her pocket to prove it, 5 guineas which had been 10 shillings earlier that morning.
"You were seen!"
her mother shrieked, flapping a lace-edged handkerchief.
"Not only placing the wager, but cheering and shouting with a crowd of rowdy young bucks at the finish line."
Evie could see how this might be considered objectionable, uncouth conduct, if she happened to be a debutante, some eligible miss fresh on the marriage mart. Someone like her half-sister Sophie. Evie, however, was 27, and so far back on the shelf she might as well be invisible. "I cannot imagine anyone would care, Mamma." She restrained herself from shrugging. "Nobody cares what I do, including you."
"Selfish, headstrong girl!"
her mother wailed, the histrionics showing no sign of decreasing in volume or intensity.
"Sir Eric Fitzwalter is on the verge of offering for Sophie, and his mother is one of the highest sticklers in the ton. Lady Fitzwalter called here not an hour hence and confided in me her very great concerns about your conduct."
Wait. Evie stilled. Is he reconsidering? He cannot be. Surely. He adores Sophie, and she's the prize of the season. She was also the one person in the world Evie loved unconditionally.
"If he marries someone else, it will be all your fault."
Evie bit her lip. She had truly never imagined that whatever she did might reflect badly on Sophie. Nobody had cared a fig for what Evie did since she'd made her own underwhelming debut.
"You're just like your father!"
And there it is. Evie was the product of her mother's first marriage to Edward Kernow, a gentleman from Cornwall her mother had never spoken of in terms of anything other than disparagement. Wastrel, rake, gambler. A fool who'd fallen from his horse during a drunken race against one of his cronies and left his widow in straitened circumstances and his daughter fatherless. The widow Kernow had been fortunate enough to catch the eye of another suitor and married Bertram Hallidan after a suitable interval of mourning. In due time they were blessed with Sophie, universally adored by all the family. Mr. Hallidan tolerated Evie well enough, but he made it clear that Sophie was the apple of his eye and heir to his considerable fortune, whereas Evie was to be considered fortunate that her mother's parents were willing to settle £1,000 on her. A different girl might have resented Sophie's good fortune, but Evie considered herself lucky. She had never wanted to be the toast of the ton, to be pursued by every young buck, and plenty not so young, with an eye to the fortune she was due to inherit. Besides, nobody could resent Sophie, the sweetest girl ever to draw breath. Evie would not for a moment see her hurt, and Sophie was genuinely fond of Sir Eric, a wealthy man in his own right, who was certainly not pursuing Sophie for her inheritance. In Evie's opinion, Sir Eric was very much the pick of Sophie's numerous suitors, and she thought he could make Sophie happy. If he cried off because of Evie's behaviour, she would never forgive herself. "I'm sorry, Mamma," she said, cutting across her mother's anguished cries. "What do you need me to do?" Surprised by Evie's genuinely contrite tone, her mother peered at her over her fluttering handkerchief, her eyes narrowing. Evie could understand her mother's suspicion. Apologies weren't something Evie tended to proffer, especially when she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. Which she didn't this time either, but she could see how the effects might punish Sophie, and that she could not allow. "What do you need me to do?" Evie repeated. "I don't want to jeopardize Sophie's match with Sir Eric. I'll do whatever it takes. Anything." Mrs. Hallidon sat back in her chair, considering her elder daughter. Mr. Hallidon had never balked at paying for Evie's wardrobe, at least, so Evie was fashionably dressed, in a dark blue riding habit which set off her blue eyes very well. Her hair was an unfashionable shade of brown, and stick straight, much to her dresser's despair, refusing to take a curl, but she was not ill-looking. With a better dowry and a more accommodating attitude, she might have attracted a collection of suitors of her own, but the few who had even considered her had soon been put off by her wilful habit of saying and doing exactly as she pleased. "Well," Mrs. Hallidon said, obviously taken aback. Her eyes narrowed craftily. "I think the best thing for all concerned would be if you were to be absent from London for a while. Since you and I both know you will not take kindly to being confined to the house, perhaps you should accept that invitation from your cousin." My cousin? Evie could not think of who her mother might mean. "Lord Pencarrow. He's taken up residence at the Cornish estate with his sister Lady Coxspeckle, and it seems they are both getting married soon. You were invited to the weddings, and to make a stay with them whenever you please." Cornwall is certainly a long way from London. Evie hadn't been to Cornwall since she was a small child, could remember nothing of it. Mr. Hallidon preferred to reside year-round in London, with an occasional short holiday to Brighton or Ramsgate. "You could stay through Christmas and New Year. Indeed, the roads will be quite dreadful. Best not to return until Easter, perhaps." Mrs. Hallidon was clearly warming rapidly to the plan. "If Sir Eric can be brought up to scratch, I think Sophie would like to be married in May or June, so you need not be back until then. And if Sir Eric wants a longer engagement, I will undoubtedly be encouraged to remain in Cornwall indefinitely." Strangely, Evie found that she was not entirely opposed to the idea. Her mother might decry Cornwall as a hellish backwater on the few occasions she had ever mentioned it, but Evie rather thought it sounded like an adventure. And though she did not know her cousins well, every time she had been in company with them, they had got along famously. Yes, she would miss Sophie, but she wouldn't miss London and the ennui which drove her so often to do and say things her mother found wildly inappropriate. "How would I get there?" she asked. "The mail coach?" "Certainly not!" her mother cried out in horror. "No, no, we will hire a proper travelling coach and guards, and a respectable lady companion to escort you there. Mr. Hallidon will not begrudge the cost. Undoubtedly, he will be pleased to be rid of me for the next half-year or so." Evie once again swallowed the words and nodded. "I will write to my cousins and tell them to expect my arrival." Chapter 2. The rattle of a coach coming down the lane to his farm startled Gryffyn Pascoe from his reverie. He had been leaning on a gate, crooning sweet nothings to the pregnant plough-mare as he fed her apple slices. Turning, he stared at the coach and four pulling up before his house, wondering who on earth might be arriving. His dog, Jip, barked and ran towards the coach. Griff arrested her with a sharp whistle and a gesture. Jip stared at him reproachfully, but lay down obediently at the gate. "Ho there!" the driver called out. "Is this Pencarrow House?" "No," Gryff answered with a shake of his head. "This is Garth Avalon. You turned off the main road 1 lane too early, I'm sorry. You'll need to turn about and go back." The driver looked at the narrow area in front of the house and clearly bit back a curse. Turning a coach and 4 in that space was going to be tricky. "Let me help you," Gryff suggested, stepping back from the gate and approaching the coach. "If I turn your leaders' heads the right way, you can ask them to back up and—" The coach door was flung open with a crash, and a female voice cried, "Oh, are we here at last? Thank goodness!" "Miss Evie!" Another female, this one sounding older. "For shame!" Gryff swallowed down a laugh. "Apologies, miss," he said to the young woman now standing in the door of the coach, "but you've not arrived. You'll be another 10 minutes to Pencarrow House." "Oh." She stared at him. "Where is this, then?" "Garth Avalon," he said gruffly, reaching for the head of the near-side leader. "You'd best sit back down, miss, so your driver and I can get you turned about." She was clearly quality. Everything about her screamed it, from her clothes to her accent. Everything he despised, in one pretty package, blue eyes scanning him from head to foot, and no doubt making her own assessment based on the plainness of his coat and his workmanlike boots. She was not sitting down either, still standing up and looking about with frank interest. "If it's only 10 minutes from here to Pencarrow House, the owners of this house must be my cousin's neighbours." She eyed Garth Avalon, obviously counting the windows and the chimneys, assessing it at a glance as a country manor of moderate worth. "Who is the owner?" "You're talking to him," Gryff muttered. "Really?" And instead of sitting back down, she jumped down from the coach and approached him with a friendly smile on her face. "Then I dare say you shall be my neighbour too, for the winter at least, and I should introduce myself. Evie Kernow." "Oh, Miss Evie," another voice said despairingly, and Gryff looked around to find another woman peering out of the coach, this one older and more plainly dressed. A maid or companion, he guessed, tasked with ensuring the younger woman behaved respectably. Clearly a gargantuan task. "Gryffyn Pascoe," he mumbled, since she'd left him little option other than to introduce himself. Clucking to the horses, he began to turn them about. "Well, it is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Pascoe. No doubt we shall see a good deal of each other." "I doubt it," he said bluntly. "I don't socialise much." "At all? Or just with my cousins?" Her blue eyes narrowed. "I like your cousins well enough," he said. "I don't socialise much with anyone." "That seems a shame. May I ask why?" "Are you always this forward with people you've just met?" Despite her probing, Gryff found himself oddly charmed. She might look like quality, but he couldn't imagine any ton miss being so forthright. There was no deception in this one. None at all. "I'm afraid so." She smiled at him, a broad grin, showing her teeth, again something no ton miss would do. "Since we are to be friends, I see little point in maintaining the formalities, do you?" "We're to be friends." The horse he was urging to step back balked, obviously tired and wanting to end his journey, and he clucked soothingly to it. "Of course we are. I shall want your permission to walk across this beautiful countryside, I'm sure, perhaps to ride, if my cousin has a horse suitable for me. We shall be friends in no time. Then I shall urge you to attend parties and social events, and teach you how to socialise." "Why?" Puzzled, he turned to face her. "Why what?" "Why do you want to teach me how to socialise? Why do you want to be my friend? You don't even know me." Those blue eyes examined him again, seeming to look right into his soul, and she said, Because it seems to me that you need to learn how to smile, Gryffyn Pascoe. I amuse most everyone I meet, and yet your lips have not so much as twitched up at the corners. I take such things as a challenge, you know. We shall be friends, and I shall teach you how to smile. I know how to smile. For the life of him, though, he couldn't remember when he last had. Couldn't prove it by me. Her own smile flashed again, a ray of sunshine on the gloomy autumn day. You should get back in the coach, he said again, utterly bemused by her, and yet entirely fascinated at the same time. These horses are tired. They need to finish their journey and get their well-earned feed in a warm stable. She didn't argue. He'd more than half expected her to. It was a rare aristocrat in his experience who gave even a passing thought to the comfort of those they considered their lessers, whether human or animal. Instead, she said, "You're right, of course. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Pascoe, and I shall hope to see you again very soon." He didn't quite know what to say to that, so he just nodded and watched as she turned on her heel, marched back to the coach door, and scrambled agilely up without bothering to pull down the step. Certainly without demanding he assist her, again, something he'd expected. "Thanks for your assistance, sir," the driver said. "Next lane down the main road, you said?" "Aye up. Turn west and follow the road towards Swain Cove. The Pencarrow house turns not a quarter of a mile. Greystone gateposts. You can't miss it." He patted the neck of the lead horse and stood back as the driver clicked his tongue to start the team off again. Griff wasn't surprised in the least when Evie leaned out of the window to wave cheerfully at him. He was very surprised to find his own hand lifting, quite of its own volition, to return the gesture. Chapter 3. "And I met your neighbour. What a terribly handsome man, even if he does seem incapable of smiling," Evie said, as she followed her cousin up the staircase. After enthusiastic greetings, Abigail had offered to show her to her room, and Evie gratefully accepted. "Which neighbour?" Abby glanced back at her, frowning in a puzzled way. "Mr. Pascoe." "Wherever did you meet him?" Abby stumbled before catching herself on the banister. "I've only met him myself a couple of times, when the apple harvest was on, and half the village turned out to go to Garth-Avalon to help pick apples. He never even goes into the village." "Well, we went to him." Evie chuckled. "The driver took the wrong turn off the road, and we ended up in his front yard. Why is he so grumpy, anyway?" "I cannot say that I've had the opportunity to observe him enough to note his manner. Gossip in the village is that he went away to war when he was quite young, but was called home to run the estate when his father died." Abby stopped at a door and swung it open, to reveal a beautifully furnished room with yellow-painted walls and a lovely view over the countryside. "This is where we've put you. It's right next door to my room." "How lovely!" Evie looked around, admiring. "Thank you. It's everything charming." The maid who'd accompanied her from London, Tilly, was unpacking her trunks in the attached dressing chamber, mumbling dourly under her breath. The maid Evie usually shared with Sophie had been unwilling to make the trip to Cornwall, for which Evie could hardly blame her, so Tilly had been hired instead, and Evie was quite sure the woman had been chosen specifically for her dour mood and dampening stare, in hopes that she might keep Evie's natural exuberance in check. A cause which became more hopeless the further they got from London. Evie had never had any opportunity to spend any time in the countryside, and she found herself fascinated by its beauty and variety, asking questions of anyone who would take the time to talk to her for even a moment. "So Mr. Pascoe grows apples?" She latched onto something else Abby had said. "Garth-Avalon, the name of his estate, means Apple Tree Hill in Cornish, or so I'm told. You can't see it from the front of the house, but if you go up to the top of the hill behind, the ground falls away into a sheltered valley, which is filled with apple trees. Most delicious they are, too, Cook makes wonderful apple pies and crumbles you must try. They're not his only product, though. Garth-Avalon is one of the larger estates hereabouts. Must be 500 acres all told. Mr. Pascoe has sheep, cattle, and grows wheat and barley too. He must employ a goodly number of people, Evie said, thinking of the man's plain coat. She'd have thought him a common labourer were it not for his cultured way of speaking and the quality of his boots, mud-covered though they'd been. And does he live all alone in that big house? Garth-Avalon was a good deal smaller than Pencarrow House, but she'd still estimated the handsome grey stone building as having 8 bedrooms at least. His mother lives with him, but she's an invalid or so I hear, and doesn't go out. I've never met her. Evie would not reproach her cousin for not doing so, but she immediately resolved that she would go and pay a visit to Mrs. Pascoe at her first opportunity. How lonely the woman must be. For now, though, she wanted to catch up with her cousins and learn more about the new neighbourhood in which she found herself. She had not yet seen the nearby village of Swain Cove yet, as Pencarrow House was a mile or 2 short of it, but knew from her cousin's letters that it was both quaintly charming and apparently something of a lodestone for trouble, considering the number of mildly shocking events which had taken place there over the last year. So, she seated herself on the edge of the bed, patted the edge of the mattress in invitation, and smiled at Abigail. "Tell me everything you were too discreet to put in writing in your letters." Griff should have been busying himself with supervising the cider-making, but he found his mind drifting at the most awkward moments to thoughts of Miss Evie Kernow's wide, infectious smile and friendly manner. What call did she have to be so cheerful and amiable to him, a complete stranger, and one who was hardly encouraging in manner besides? The more he thought about it, the grumpier he felt. Someone should take the chit in hand. Tell her that her fearlessness was liable to get her into trouble. Certainly, he wasn't going to tolerate her insistence that the two of them would be friends, and she would teach him how to smile, of all things. Yes, when next he saw Evie Kernow, he would have a few words to say to her. Except, he wasn't sure when that might be. Christmas was not many weeks away now, and Lord Pencarrow had certainly indicated that he intended to host at least a few social events, to which Griff would surely be invited, but he hadn't planned to go. Certainly, he wasn't going to go solely in order to find Evie and tell her off. Nor was he going to visit Pencarrow House to call on her. Such a visit was highly likely to be misconstrued as his having entirely different intentions. He stewed on the matter as he checked the fencing in his sheep paddock, pumped water to fill their drinking trough, and hauled one foolish ewe out of a muddy patch she was too silly to stay out of on her own. "Typical female," he muttered at the ewe, shooing her away when she tried to run straight back into the mud. "Not got the sense you were born with. And yet, here I am, pining because I can't think of a good opportunity to tell off an infuriating woman I've only met the once." The distant sound of bells reached him, carried on the breeze, and he straightened. "Of course," he said aloud. "She'll be at church." It was Friday, so he wasn't quite sure why the bells were ringing today, though he vaguely recalled hearing something about a wedding. But Sunday was the day after tomorrow, and surely Miss Kernow would be at church, in the Pencarrow House pew, right in front of Garth-Avalon's pew. And though Griff wouldn't be so rude as to reproach her in church, surely he would be able to draw her aside for a private moment afterward to give her a piece of his mind. Satisfied with the plan, he cast one final glance over the sheep flock before securing the gate and turning to walk back to the house. He'd need to wash up. He was all over mud from wrangling the ewe, and then perhaps grab a bite to eat with his mother before going over to the cider house. He was startled, rounding the side of the house, to find a young groom leading 2 horses towards his stables. One of them bore a lady's side saddle. "Who are you?" Griff asked abruptly. The groom tugged his forelock respectfully. "Jem Harrelson, sir, down from Pencarrow House."
accompanying Miss Evie. Was just taking the horses inside to rest while I wait for her, by your leave."
Gryff was so shocked he didn't even answer the groom, just strode rapidly toward the house, his mind churning. The chit had the gall to visit him. How dare she? He was brought up short as he stormed into the house by a most unexpected sound, his mother's laughter. "It is so very kind of you to visit me," he heard his mother's voice as he paused by the parlour door. "I get so few visitors." "That is a shame, Mrs. Pascoe, and I am very glad I put myself to the trouble." "She sounds genuine." Gryff stole away on silent feet, going to the mudroom behind the kitchen to remove his filthy boots and coat and wash his hands. Cleaned up, he returned to the parlour on the heels of his housekeeper, Mrs. Bateman, bearing a tea tray. She nodded her thanks as he opened the door and held it for her. "Gryffyn!" His mother beamed up at him from her wheeled bath chair, parked close beside the crackling fire. "Do come in and meet Miss Evie Kernow. She has come to stay with her cousins at Pencarrow House."
"We've met."
He stooped to kiss his mother's cheek.
"Miss Kernow."
He offered her a terse nod. "I hope you'll forgive my intrusion, Mr. Pascoe." Evie flashed that damnably charming smile at him, showing off her dimples. "When my cousin told me your mother was an invalid unable to pay visits, I determined to pay her a visit myself. My grandmother was an invalid too, and I remember well how much she enjoyed company."
"She's no longer with you?"
"She passed 4 years ago. I miss her." Her smile had vanished, her lips turning down at the corners and her sparkling eyes dulling. Inexplicably, Gryff wanted her to smile again.
"I'm sorry for your loss."
His mother was looking between the two of them, a sly little smile beginning to curl her mouth. Gryff wanted to tell her to stop speculating, stop thinking what he just knew she was thinking. Wanted to give Evie the dressing down he'd been mentally rehearsing for days. But he just couldn't do it. Not considering this was the first time in months he'd seen his mother looking anything other than weary and sad. So instead, he took a seat and asked Evie how she liked her tea. He saw her eyebrows raise, saw her glance at his mother, and then obviously reassessed the situation, seeing how difficult it would be for Mrs. Pascoe to reach the tea service. "A teaspoon of honey and a slice of lemon, thank you," Evie said politely, and accepted the cup as he offered it. "Is that ginger cake? I absolutely love ginger cake. Thank you so much." Her enthusiasm was refreshing, Gryff thought, as he watched her use her fork to scoop up a neat little bite of the cake. The society misses he'd met during his one abortive year in London had rarely done anything so gauche as actually eat in front of a potential suitor. Evie didn't seem to care if he saw her eating.
"How are your cousins?"
he asked, feeling awkward.
"I have not seen them in some weeks."
"They are very well, thank you. I did ask Abigail if she would care to accompany me today, but she had some errands to run in Swain Cove."
"And do you find Swain Cove to your liking?"
"Why, yes, indeed. It is very different from London, of course, which is all I am accustomed to." "Your family live in London year-round?" his mother asked. "Indeed. Which is very busy, if you take my meaning. I am finding I enjoy the quieter pace of country life infinitely more, if I am honest." She flashed that smile again. "And I am always honest, to a fault, Mamma tells me." Mrs. Pascoe chuckled. "Better than the alternative. Too many folks with secrets around Swain Cove. It's a pleasure to meet someone who is an open book." Gryff winced. Ever since the accident which had left his mother without the use of her legs, Swain Cove's most profitable industry was a topic which was entirely off-limits in Garth Avalon. The Pascoe family had been allied with the gentleman, and indeed still were. The secret cellars beneath the cider house had been used for many years to conceal goods from the excisemen. One stormy night 20 years ago, Amanda Pascoe had been recruited to lead the excisemen a merry dance while the gentlemen moved their goods. A fall from her horse on the cliff path had very nearly claimed her life. While the villagers had rallied around the Pascoe family in the aftermath of the tragedy, Amanda's anger and resentment when she realised she would never walk again had driven them away again. Gryff suspected she wished she'd acted otherwise now, in her loneliness. Evie's unexpected visit was their first caller in quite some time. Evie was looking from him to his mother, obviously a little puzzled at Mrs. Pascoe's outburst. Quickly, Gryff changed the subject, asking Evie to tell them something of her life in London, saying he was sure his mother would enjoy hearing about it. She followed his lead willingly enough, but he could see in her eyes that she was still thinking about his mother's comment, wondering who in Swain Cove had secrets, and no doubt planning just how she was going to ferret it all out. Damn clever women, anyway. Chapter 4. "Here comes your Mr. Pascoe." Abigail nudged Evie, not at all subtly, and not at all having bothered to keep her voice down. "He's not my Mr. Pascoe, and hush!" Evie could feel the flames coming to her cheeks, which was entirely ridiculous. She was not some blushing debutante. She was a woman of 27, and so far back on the shelf she practically required dusting. "Lady Coxspackle." Gryffyn offered a respectful little bow to Abigail first, before turning to Evie. "Miss Kernow." "Still no smile for me, Mr. Pascoe," she could not help but say pertly. "It has been too long since I smiled, Miss Kernow. I believe I have forgotten how." "A tragedy, and one I am determined to rectify. But at least you sing." "I distinguished a very fine baritone coming from the pew behind ours, and was delighted to turn about and see it belonged to you." He ducked his head slightly, almost bashful. "I wanted to thank you for paying a call on my mother," he said abruptly then. "She has spoken of little but your visit since. I am charged with inviting you, and Lady Coxspackle and Lord Pencarrow, to dinner next Wednesday." He did not seem particularly pleased to be issuing the invitation, Evie thought. "And Mr. and Miss McJohn, of course," Gryff added, which made both Evie and Abigail smile approvingly at him. "I'm sure Hiram, Tobias, and Zipporah will be delighted," Abigail said. "As am I. I look forward to meeting Mrs. Pascoe. It is an oversight that I have not called on her before now, and I am sorry for it." Her apology was accepted graciously, before Gryff made another little bow and went on his way. Evie stood for a moment admiring the back view. He wasn't a particularly tall man, perhaps an inch or so above average, but he had fine broad shoulders, shown to good advantage by the cut of his coat, his dark curls tossing in the brisk breeze as he politely doffed his hat to a lady who called a greeting to him. Abigail nudged her in the ribs again. "Not your Mr. Pascoe, my foot!" "Oh, shush!" Evie's cheeks flamed again. "I'm fairly sure he doesn't even like me." "I'm not sure he likes anyone much, but certainly he could barely take his eyes off you. I think he looked at me for a total of, perhaps it might have been as many as 7 seconds during that conversation." Evie had noticed that. Gryffyn's eyes were very dark, intense, and they had barely left her face for a moment. "Is he coming to the wedding?" she asked, trying to sound artless, as she and Abigail walked down the hill from St. Brioch's church. "He is certainly invited, but I cannot recall whether we have received an acceptance. I will look later if you like. Shall I seat you beside him at the wedding breakfast?" "Oh, no," Evie said quickly, and then she rethought. "Actually, yes. But please stop teasing me that there might be anything romantic between us. I have set myself a challenge to teach him how to smile." "Have you indeed? Well, I wish you luck of it." A wide smile spread across Abigail's own face then, as Zipporah McJohn came to join them, taking Abigail's hand for a brief, subtle handclasp before they got into the carriage. Once again, a conversation with Miss Kernow had not gone at all as Griff had envisioned it. He'd been standing directly behind her in church, listened as she sang the hymn with the same enthusiasm she seemed to bring to everything she did. And even more distractingly, he could smell her, a soft scent of lavender and wild heather, which seemed to be in her hair, drifting to his nostrils every time she moved her head. At least twice he had caught himself unconsciously leaning closer, trying to catch that elusive scent. He needed to get a grip on himself, or he would do something uncouth like actually sniff her, and he could only imagine what might come out of her mouth if she caught him at it.
"Ho there, Pascoe!"
someone hollered at him, and he turned his head to see old Granny Smith waving, trying to catch his attention. "Granny," he greeted her. She wasn't his grandmother, but nobody in Swain Cove called her anything but Granny, and hadn't in his memory. Wrinkled and white-haired, she peered up at him from rheumy eyes and let out a cheerful little cackle.
"Don't see you often at church, laddie. Sniffing round the skirts of that new lass, are you, eh? Eh?"
"Absolutely not," he said forbiddingly.
"She's a good lass, but she's a mite too curious for her own good. Needs someone to keep an eye on her. Already asking more questions than the gentleman would be happy with."
"You should probably mention that to her cousins," Griff said, a little desperately, glancing about in search of an escape.
"I'm mentioning it to you."
Granny's eyes narrowed.
"Tell her it isn't wise to be poking her nose into certain folks' business, or she might get her fingers burned."
"I think you're mixing your metaphors, Granny. But very well," when she glared at him. "I'll tell her something." Evie hadn't just come for her cousin's weddings. The rumour among servants was that she was to stay until springtime at least, sent away from London after a scandal. He could well believe she'd caused a scandal of some sort. And he could well believe her capable of getting into the kind of trouble she couldn't easily get out of, if she was asking the sort of questions the gentleman wouldn't take kindly to. Her relationship to Pencarrow would offer more protection than the average person would have, but she still needed warning off. With a sigh, he walked to where he'd tethered his horse, swinging up onto the patient gelding's back with a pat and a murmured word of praise. Somehow, between now and dinner on Wednesday, he'd have to find the words to explain to Evie that she was now living in a literal den of smugglers and thieves. Everyone she knew was in on the conspiracy, and she needed to play along for her own good.
"Oh, are you talking about the smugglers?"
"Hush." Griff looked around a little desperately, though he was confident they weren't overheard. He had invited Evie to walk to the top of the hill behind Garth Avalon in order to watch the sunset, which promised to be a surprisingly pretty one for an October evening. Everyone else present in the parlour having a glass of pre-dinner sherry had smirked behind their hands, and he knew very well they all thought he was trying to court her. He just couldn't think of any other way to have this conversation privately.
"I know all about it. Abigail was terribly discreet in her letters, but one learns to read between the lines, and I pestered her to tell me the whole truth once I arrived."
"Then why are you still asking questions about it in the village?" he exclaimed, exasperated beyond measure with her.
"Well, because it's terribly exciting. The most exciting thing I've ever been close to being involved in. Oh, wait. You mean the smugglers know I've been asking questions and they're—"
She trailed off. "Not best pleased about it."
"Well," she hung her head a little, "what an absolute ninny you must think me."
He couldn't stand to see her like that, all her fire and vivacity gone, as she drooped like a bedraggled snowdrop. "Not a ninny," he said, trying to make his voice kinder. "You just don't know how things are here. It's a dangerous business, and the gentlemen protect their own."
"Of course. A man could be hanged or transported if he was caught smuggling. I quite understand."
Her head came back up, a curious expression coming to her face.
"Wait a moment. How do you know about it?"
"Everyone knows about the gentleman hereabouts, Miss Kernow," he prevaricated.
"Not that. How did you know I'd been asking questions about the smuggling?"
The sparkle returned to her eyes.
"You're one of them, aren't you?"
"You'd have made a fine excise officer," he couldn't help saying, before he firmly damped down her enthusiasm. "I'm not one of them, no. But I do know many of them, and it's known that I know you. I was asked to speak with you."
"Why? Surely Tobias would have been a better choice."
"Oh." He could almost see her mind working as she put the pieces together. She glanced down towards the house below them on the hillside, back at him and the polite yard of distance he had put between them once they stopped ascending the hill and she took her hand from his arm.
"They think you're courting me!"
Evie exclaimed. And to Griff's absolute disgust, she burst into laughter. "Why's that funny?" he grumbled, crossing his arms and glowering at her. Evie was very nearly howling, hands on her hips, half bent over. She flapped a hand at him, laughing even harder.
"Look at you!"
she choked out between chortles.
"You can barely stand me!"
"That's not true," he denied immediately. "I quite admire you." Evie's laughter stopped almost immediately, and she gave him an incredulous stare.
"You do?"
"I admire your determination," he admitted. "And your confidence. You're good with people, in a way I wish I could emulate." She tilted her head, considering him, and then that smile spread across her lips again. She leaned towards him and spoke confidingly.
"There's a secret to it. Do you want to know what it is?"
Yes. Of course he wanted to know. He'd always envied those who had the knack of making friends easily. Well, it starts like this. She was just standing there, smiling. Puzzled, he frowned at her. "I don't understand." Maintaining eye contact, Evie lifted her hand, pointed at her face, and described an exaggerated curve with her finger, indicating her smile. "If you smile at folks, they tend to smile back. That's the first step." He just stared at her, and after a moment she sighed and turned to look away again, watching the last golden rays of the setting sun as the sky turned to a blaze of orange and violet. "Did you ever know how to smile?" The question was soft. "When I was small, I suppose," he said. "And then my mother had her accident, and our house became a serious place when nobody smiled. Ever. My father became harsh. He taught me himself, at home. He feared me going away, was convinced if I was out of his sight, I too would somehow be injured as my mother was. I wasn't allowed friends. Pets." He gestured to his faithful sheepdog, Jip, who had ambled up the hill after them and lay in the thick grass not far away, keeping a watchful eye on proceedings. "Not even a working dog for the farm, lest I become attached to it." Attachments were dangerous, she said, obviously understanding. "Exactly." He took a deep breath, ready to tell her the rest. To speak of what he'd never even been able to tell his mother. "When I was 17, I ran away. Took the king's shilling and joined the army as a common soldier. Got myself shipped off to the continent to fight before my father could track me down and bring me back." Evie turned to look at him again. "Was it awful?" "Utterly, unspeakably terrible. Anyone who talks about the glory of war has clearly never seen it." He couldn't speak of the things he'd seen, the blood and the horror. Not ever. I survived it. Somehow. My father finally tracked me down, or had men do it, and I was summoned home, brought to the War Office. I refused to resign my post, so instead they promoted me and shuffled me into a training regiment. Safer, you see. Appeasing my father, who had some powerful friends. Why do I feel like that was actually worse than fighting the war for you? Evie murmured. It was. All I was doing was feeding more boys, and they were boys, too young to be men, to the cannons. Too many of them would never go home again. He could still feel the guilt of it weighing him down. All those souls. Intellectually, he knew their deaths weren't on his conscience, that his actions and the training he'd imparted might have even helped save a few who otherwise wouldn't have made it. But sometimes he still saw their accusing faces in his dreams. "When did you come home?" Evie asked, her voice still so soft and gentle. "A little more than a year ago, when my father passed. My mother needed me." "Of course," she agreed. And yet he still felt guilt over that too, still felt as though he'd abandoned his post. Let his fellow soldiers down. Gryff was startled to feel a small hand creep into his. Slight fingers squeezed on his own. "I can't imagine what it was like for you," Evie said quietly. "And I'm not going to say anything trite about everything being all right now, because one only has to look at a newspaper to know that's not true, even if the war is over at last. But I will say that you have to look forward. And just look at this." She flung up her free arm, indicating the rolling hills before them, the sea off to their left a mile or so distant, the last golden rays illuminating the apple orchard. Jip watching them with her tongue lolling, a doggy smile on her shaggy face. "Look at the beauty that's all around you, and find joy in it." All he could see was her face. The light in her eyes, the way the breeze made the soft wisps of hair around her face dance against her cheeks. Her lips, pink and so plush, he had to restrain himself from reaching out to touch, to find out if they were really as soft as they looked. Chapter 5. They stood on top of the hill watching the sun set until it was almost entirely dark, and a sudden nip in the breeze made Evie shiver. "You're cold," Gryff exclaimed, and at once insisted they walk back down to the house. "Dinner will be ready besides, and Mother will be wondering where we are." He seemed suddenly to realise her hand was still tucked into his, looked down at it and shook his head, his mouth twisting wryly. "I'm afraid we've given them no reason to think their conclusions about my courting you are incorrect." "Are you?" But even Evie, normally so fearless, couldn't quite make herself ask him that question. She feared getting an answer she didn't like. Dinner was very pleasant. Seated beside Mrs. Pascoe, Evie discovered the older woman had a tremendous dry wit. She did smile, though very little, and with a curious grimace, as though the expression was ill-practised for her. It was apparent that she was also very well read, and they discovered a mutual love of Shakespeare and Defoe, and that they both considered Wordsworth too flowery. "I have a great deal of time to read, of course," Mrs. Pascoe said. "My son is very generous and orders for me as many books as I please. The bookseller in Exeter sends a parcel for me at least once a month. You are welcome to come and browse my little library if you wish for something to read." "I will certainly take you up on that offer, and thank you kindly for it," Evie said promptly. "With 2 weddings about to take place from Pencarrow House, it seems nobody there can talk about anything else, and it is a subject I am intensely disinterested in. Some good books to read will be much appreciated." "And why is the topic of weddings of such extreme disinterest, may I ask?" Mrs. Pascoe's eyes were uncomfortably sharp. Evie gave a small shrug, trying to look unconcerned. "I am firmly on the shelf, ma'am. Since it seems clear marriage is not something I will ever experience for myself, I find it a topic not worthy of my attention." "Firmly on the shelf?" Mrs. Pascoe let out a shocked laugh. "You cannot be more than 23. I have never heard such nonsense." "I am 27, and it is nothing but the truth. I am here to avoid jeopardizing my younger sister's chances on the marriage mart with my spinsterish bad habits," Evie admitted baldly. "Bad habits?" Mrs. Pascoe only looked more intrigued. "I cannot imagine what you might mean." "The last straw was when I was caught betting on a horse race, with a group of young gentlemen and nary a chaperone in sight," Evie confessed. "That sounds very much like something I would have done in my youth." Clear grey eyes, exactly the same shade as her son's, twinkled with mirth. "But then, I too was considered an unmarriageable rebel, or I would have been, if I hadn't been convinced since my childhood that I was going to marry Gryffyn Pascoe." "Were you born here in Swain Cove, then?" Evie asked curiously. "I was. I've family all over the district." "And yet none of them visit you?" As soon as the question was out of her mouth, Evie clapped her hand over it. "I'm sorry," she gasped between her fingers. "That was intolerably rude. Pray forget I said it." Mrs. Pascoe waved a hand, dismissing her concern. "I take no insult, Evie. It was my choice, not my family's." She looked a little wistful. "Have you never reconsidered?" Evie asked, after a brief moment of consternation and debating whether she should ask the question. "Some people, men especially, I find, seem to think that changing one's mind demonstrates weakness of character, but personally, I hold the opposite belief. Changing one's mind after due consideration shows a flexibility and strength of character I find admirable." "It has been a long time," Mrs. Pascoe murmured. "Must it be forever?" Evie smiled at the other woman, said gently, "If you were to tell me the names of anyone in particular you would like to see again, I could mention to them that I have met you, and you would be open to receiving visits from family again." "You are very kind. I shall think on it," Mrs. Pascoe said. "Now, do tell me something of the fashions in London this year." Evie accepted the change of subject and began a detailed description of the fabulous gown her sister Sophie had worn to her coming out. From the corner of her eye she saw Griff's face darken as she talked, and wondered just what he had against describing fashions. In typical Evie fashion, she decided to ask him, and cornered him in the parlour after dinner. For a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer her, and then he sighed. "When I was called home after my father's passing, I almost brought a bride with me," he said abruptly. "I'd been in Brighton, stationed with my regiment for a short while. Thought myself in love with a young lady there, Miss Felicity Arbuthnot." This information came as quite a shock, and Evie had to fight to keep her mouth from falling open. An odd pain twinged in her chest, and she pressed her hand flat over her heart. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "I invited her, with her family, of course, to come down for a visit, a month after I got home. We were not yet engaged, but I wanted my intentions to be clear, wanted to ensure she would accept. It would be an unofficial engagement until I was out of mourning." Gryff parted the drapes and looked out of the window briefly, checking the weather. The sky remained clear, and he allowed the curtain to fall back again. They didn't stay a single night. Felicity barely allowed one satin-slippered foot to touch the ground outside the coach before turning to her mother, breaking down in tears, and declaring that she could never live in such purgatory as Cornwall. Evie, for once, was lost for words. How terribly cruel of the young woman to let Gryff down in such a way, and immediately after his father's passing, when he must already have been devastated with grief. "And the fashion thing, I assume it was her great passion?" she asked after a few moments of silence. "Indeed." He gave a single choppy nod. "Foolish of me, perhaps, to still find myself resentful of it, all this time later." "Didn't you say it was only a year since your father's passing? That isn't long at all. The grief of losing your father, combined with Miss Arbuthnot treating you so abominably, of course it still feels fresh and painful for you to be reminded, and I am sorry for doing so, however accidentally." The hard lines of his face softened minutely as he looked down at her. "It's hardly your fault, Miss Kernow. You weren't to know."
"Evie," she insisted. "You must call me Evie, since we are friends, and as friends, I still care that you were hurt by what I said."
Gryff's face softened even further. "You're a good person, Evie," he said quietly. "And not at all like I thought you were when I first saw you." She cocked her head, gave him a curious look.
"And what was that?"
"I saw your pretty, expensive dress, heard your accent, and I thought you were just like her. Another high society miss who'd take one look at everything I love and hightail it back to town so fast the mud didn't even get to touch her shoes." Evie laughed, the sound bright and merry, making everyone else glance around from their conversations. Secret smiles were exchanged, but Evie ignored them.
"And instead, here I am, scheming to stay as long as possible, so I don't have to go back to London at all. I've been trying to convince Abigail to let me stay on indefinitely after the weddings. Live at Pencarrow House permanently. A dependent relation, of course, but I can make myself useful. Neither Abby nor Zip have any liking for housekeeping, and I'm quite good at it."
Gryff looked at her in silence for a long time, and finally he said abruptly, "It's all wrong for you. The men in London must all be idiots. Some duke or earl should have snapped you up long ago."
Evie's peal of laughter rang out again. "Me? A duchess? Well, I'm very flattered, but I can just imagine how much offence I would manage to cause with my unmanageable ways."
"That's the point of being a duchess, isn't it?" Gryff said, with an unexpected flash of humour. "You can give offence to anyone you like, and they're not allowed to be offended." She pointed at him, still chortling herself.
"A joke! And that was very nearly a smile, Gryffyn Pascoe. I shall make you smile yet."
"If anyone can, I believe it's you," he said quietly, the hard lines of his face softening even further. They gazed at each other for another long moment before Abigail called Evie over, asking her to make up a fourth so the ladies might play a hand of whist. Evie knew very well that Abigail and Zip both thought whist as dull as ditchwater, but obviously were agreeing to play to make Mrs. Pascoe happy, which was very kind of them.
"Of course," she agreed, going over and taking a seat at the card table as Gryff went to wheel his mother's chair across to join them. "I should be delighted. Mrs. Pascoe, will you partner me?" "I am sadly out of practice, I fear," Mrs. Pascoe murmured. "Then perhaps Abby and Zip will have the merest chance against us, because I must tell you I am cutthroat at it. It's my mother's favourite."
Chapter 6. Gryff watched as Evie charmed his mother into smiling once more. Evie's slender hands were deft as she shuffled and dealt the cards, talking and laughing all the while, Abigail and Zipporah both giggling at her jokes. Her charisma was undeniable, and once again he wondered at the foolishness of the men in London. So, Evie was outspoken and honest to a fault. What of it? He could not comprehend why that alone should apparently have been enough to disqualify her from consideration on the marriage mart. She was a prize well worth the winning, even without much in the way of dowry, something Lord Pencarrow mentioned, apparently quite casually, as he poured some brandy for the three gentlemen. "Her father was my uncle, and ran through his portion of inheritance before his passing," Tobias noted, "as well as his wife's dowry. Evie's stepfather is wealthy, but a miser with no plans to settle anything on Evie. It's all going to her half-sister Sophie, who isn't in need of it." "Why not?" Gryff asked, accepting the brandy with a nod of thanks. "She's lauded as a diamond of the first water. Everything Evie isn't. Quiet and sweet, gentle manners, not much of a brain in her head. She's had her pick of wealthy suitors." "It's ridiculous," Gryff said, his gaze still resting on Evie, on her animated, laughing face, as she effortlessly carried the conversation at the card table. "The ton are all so concerned about breeding. Why wouldn't a man want a clever wife? A silly one is like to get you stupid children. I hope anyone who breeds animals knows that for a truth," Hiram murmured. "Most of the ton would never think of breeding for anything other than inherited wealth, or perhaps good looks," Tobias said dryly. "Unlike country folk, who have entirely different concerns. Talking of which, how are your sheep going, Gryff? Expecting a good crop of lambs come spring?" "Hard to know until the lambing starts, but my ram was certainly doing his job these last few weeks. If a sheep could smile, I reckon he'd have a fine smirk on his face." Tobias and Hiram both chortled, and Gryff realised to his astonishment that he'd made another joke. A muscle twitched in his cheek, and sharp-eyed Tobias spotted it. "She'll win that wager yet, you know," Tobias said. "Wager?" "Evie made a wager with my sister that she'd make you smile before Wassail night." "Wassail night?" Gryff frowned, puzzled. "Why Wassail night?" "Well, Evie did say 12th night, but Abby told her we don't really celebrate that here, that we celebrate Wassail night instead, and since you're the apple farmer, you're the host." Tobias looked struck. "You do still host Wassail night here at Garth Avalon, don't you?" "Abby and I were telling Evie about all the times we came here as children. It never occurred to me that you might not still carry on the tradition." "Yes." Gryff cleared his throat, tried again when the word came out oddly rusty. "Even in his last year, when my father was ill, he insisted on hosting the Wassail. I'd never disrespect his memory by failing in my duty." "Duty?" Hiram hooted with laughter, his eyes crinkling in his weathered face. "I don't recall there being a lot of duty about Wassail night. Just a hell of a lot of cider and mischief." "That's why we host it in January," Gryff said, "to cut down on the mischief. Or far too many folks would be getting up to worse than a bit of kissing in the apple orchard." Hiram and Tobias carefully didn't look at each other, and Gryff wondered if they'd maybe kissed in his apple orchard on Wassail night a time or two. None of his business if they had, of course. A peal of laughter from the card table made him glance in that direction, and he saw to his astonishment that it was his mother laughing, clutching her sides and chortling at something Evie had said. "She's brought more laughter to this house than it's seen in 20 years, he murmured. "Something of a miracle worker, your cousin." "Apparently so," Tobias said, and gave Hiram another secretive look. As Gryff walked away to find out just what his mother found so amusing, he heard Tobias say in an undertone, "I'm going to win my wager too, you know." "Evie really is a miracle worker," was all Hiram said in response, and Gryff was left to wonder just what this other wager was Tobias mentioned. December dawned wet and cold, with snow dusting the ground early in the month, and Evie found herself confined to Pencarrow House far more than she liked. She was busy. With the dual weddings due to take place just before Christmas, there were 1,000 small tasks to do, many of which fell to her lot, as neither Zip nor Abby were inclined to them. But she yearned for the fresh air she rather thought she was becoming addicted to, and if she was entirely honest with herself, she also longed to see Gryff. So, on the first day when she woke to find the weather dry, though frost coated the ground, she called for a horse to be saddled and a groom to accompany her, and set off across the crisply crackling grassy fields towards Garth Avalon. The house had just come into sight when she was distracted from her mission by the most ghastly, piteous sound coming from a hollow to her left. "Whatever is that, Jem?" she cried. "I dunno, miss, but I think you'd best stay here and let me take a look." The groom was talking to empty air as Evie sprang from her horse and hurried forward. "Oh, the poor creature!" she cried as she saw the sheep, trapped in a thick briar patch and bleating plaintively. "Have you a knife, Jem? We'll need to cut her free." "Nay, miss." The groom dismounted and approached, eyeing the sheep with disfavour."Stupid beastie," he muttered. "Not the brains God gave a goat." Well, no, otherwise she'd be a goat, wouldn't she? Get back on your horse and ride down to Garth Avalon, find Mr. Pascoe or one of his men, and tell them this poor ewe is trapped. I'll try and get her loose. Evie was glad she had gloves on, as she tried to pluck away the first bramble, and thorns promptly caught on the leather. "Aye, miss," Jem said with a sigh, obviously reluctant to leave her alone, but he was quick enough to get back on his horse and trot off towards the house. Evie had made exactly no progress towards freeing the ewe when hoofbeats made her look around. Gryff swung down from Jem's horse, shaking his head at her. "Get away from there before you hurt yourself." "I'm not going to hurt myself," Evie argued at once, even as the ewe let out another plaintive bleat and struggled violently, bumping Evie and making her stumble backwards and sit down hard on her bottom on the frozen ground. "Ouch!" "Are you all right?" Gryff crouched beside her, concern creasing his brow. "Where are you hurt?" "Only my pride." She smiled at him. "And one other spot, which is quite unmentionable, so I shan't." For a moment, she thought it was actually happening. That he was actually going to smile, because a muscle in his cheek quivered and the corners of his mouth twitched, just the slightest bit. Then he shook his head, and a strong hand curled about her upper arm. "Up you come, then." He seemed to take no effort at all in hauling her to her feet, and for a moment as she came upright she was braced against him, the solid strength of his body, their faces close together as he looked down at her, and Evie forgot how to breathe. It was a strange, timeless moment when the whole world seemed to stop moving. Their faces were so close. Gryff's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a wild, shocking instant, Evie thought he was going to kiss her. Then the ewe bleated again, and Gryff let go of her arm, stepping away and sliding a wickedly sharp-looking knife out of his boot. "Stupid animal," Evie muttered under her breath. Why couldn't the ewe have just stayed quiet another minute or two? Realizing that she'd wanted Gryff to kiss her was a revelation, though. What on earth was she thinking? He was the grumpiest man she'd ever met, and clearly still dealing with a lot of personal issues from his father's death and his fiancée's desertion, not to mention long-held trauma from his mother's accident when he was just a child, which had obviously changed the Pascoe family dynamic so dramatically. Watching him rescue the ewe, she consoled herself with the thought that it would only have been a kiss. She knew there was no future for them. He'd made it clear he wasn't interested in courting her. What would a kiss have mattered, anyway? By the time Gryff finally freed the still piteously bleating sheep, Evie had talked herself back around to wanting to kiss Gryff again. She took a shy step closer to him as he shoved his knife back into his boot, suddenly feeling tongue-tied and unsure what to say. "You should cut down these brambles," was what came out of her mouth. "Another sheep might get stuck." "Really, Evie? Talking about sheep?" "No," Gryff said succinctly, making her blink. "Why? They're just brambles." He sighed, reached out a hand and placed it beneath her elbow, guiding her around the bramble patch and into a hollow behind, gesturing to where a dark hole suddenly became visible in the hillside. "They're here to conceal this." "Oh, my goodness!" Astonished, she looked up at him and then back at the hole. "What is that?" "One of those things that are none of your business and you shouldn't ask questions about," he responded dryly. "But it's on your land. You said you weren't one of them." "I'm not," he said, and sighed when she just stared at him inquisitively. "Come along, then. I'll show you. We can't be long, though. I told Jem to go get something to eat in the kitchen while I borrowed his horse, but if we don't get along there soon, he'll come looking for you." "He's a teenage boy." Evie waved away his concern. "He'll stay in the kitchen as long as your housekeeper keeps feeding him." You might be right there." Gryff moved towards the hole, a tunnel entrance Evie realised now, and stooped to grope around for something, holding up a lantern after a moment. A flint from his pocket soon produced a spark, and he had the lantern alight a moment later. "Follow me," he told Evie, "and stay close." She glanced at the horses, but they were both grazing peacefully and didn't seem inclined to wander, so she followed Gryffyn to the tunnel, desperately curious about what she was about to see. His broad back blocked most of the lantern's light, so she could see very little. She followed close on his heels, stumbling occasionally on the uneven floor of the tunnel. It seemed a natural cave, level and quite dry, with a few spots where she thought it had been widened to allow a person to pass through. At one point Gryff had to turn sideways to squeeze through a tight spot, but then the passage widened out and they came to a wooden door. Gryff didn't hesitate before opening it and going through. "Where are we?" Evie hissed, reluctant to raise her voice. "Is anyone else here?" "Nobody will be here in daylight, no." Gryff held the lantern aloft, illuminating a large, roughly circular space. Boxes, crates and barrels were stacked in neat piles, and Evie couldn't resist a look into the nearest crate. "Turnips?" She stared, puzzled. "Why are the gentlemen smuggling turnips?" "They're hollowed out and filled with other things. Takes a bit of time, and it's a task best done away from prying eyes." Ah! She understood now. This was something of a warehouse, an area where goods were stored and in some cases repackaged before being moved on to their eventual destinations. "You were right that this is on my land, technically under my land, but I never know what's here or who is handling it. What I don't know, I can't let slip, you understand?" She nodded, not really understanding who he might let the information slip to, considering Gryff was one of the most taciturn people she'd ever met. "I understand." She glanced up at the ceiling, which was wooden-beamed and showed boards above. "Are we in a cellar under the house?" "No, under the cider house. There's a secret trap-door, but it's only to be used in case of dire emergency. We don't want the excisemen connecting Garth Avalon with the gentleman." He pointed to another door on the other side of the cave. "They use that passage mostly. It leads out to the cliffs. The one we came in by is the escape route." Right. She was dying of curiosity as to what was in the rest of the crates and barrels, but restrained herself. "Thank you for trusting me and showing me this. I promise I won't tell anyone, but we'd better go back in case Jem comes looking for us." "Don't worry about Jem." Gryff gave her a wry glance. "His father's one of the gentlemen. He knows all about this place. Dare say he did his best to encourage you not to stop, in case you stumbled over the entrance." "I didn't give him much of a choice, I'm afraid." "No doubt." He gestured back the way they'd come, and Evie let him guide her out and then help her back up onto her horse. "Thank you," she murmured, as Gryff swung back up onto the other horse's back. "You'd best come onto the house. Then Jem can escort you home." "Well, I was on my way to your house anyway." "Why?" he asked bluntly, and she stared at him and let out a little laugh. "Honestly, because I'm bored senseless. I thought I'd pay a visit to your mother, and hoped I might see you so I can work on teasing that smile out that I know is in there somewhere." "Ha!" "Was that a laugh? I think it was very nearly one." Excited, Evie bounced a little in her saddle, causing her mare to break into a trot. "Oh no, sorry, girl. Don't trot on this frosty grass. You'll slip." "You've a care for horses. Like them, do you?" Gryff asked, as she gently eased the mare back in alongside him. "I like all animals, not that I've ever had much opportunity to be around them. My mother has a lap spaniel, and there was always a cat in the kitchens to keep the mice down." Evie sighed wistfully. "Just one more thing I'll miss about Cornwall." "What?" He stiffened. "You're leaving?" "My sister Sophie is getting married, and though my mother wanted a summer wedding, it seems the groom is not eager to wait so long. He wants to be married in the first week of February, so I am summoned back to London before that. I'll stay until Wassail night. My cousins tell me it's the biggest celebration of the year hereabouts, and I wouldn't miss that." Gryff's expression was inscrutable, but Evie happened to glance down at his hands and saw his white knuckles as his grip tightened on the reins. And a tiny glimmer of hope began to dawn in her heart. Chapter 7. "Gryff," his mother said as they sat at dinner one evening, "we have been invited to the weddings at Pencarrow House, haven't we?" He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, eyeing her thoughtfully. "Yes." "And I presume you have declined because I'm not able to go?" "Well, I didn't formally decline, but I may have mentioned to Tobias, that evening they came to dinner, that we would be unlikely to be able to attend." "I should like to go." Her jaw trembled as she said it, as though she was having to force the words out. "I know it will be a great deal of trouble." "No, it will not." He set down his fork and leaned his chin on his hand, peering at her intently. "If you would truly like to go, nothing could be simpler. We will have that light wheeled chair you sometimes use in the summer-time in the gardens, transported over to Pencarrow House by cart, and we will take the carriage to the church and then to Pencarrow House on the day." "You'll have to carry me at the church and then into Pencarrow House." "What, do you think my muscle's not up to the task, Mother?" She gaped at him. "What?" Gryff asked, a little uncomfortable at the shock on her face. "That was a joke. Good Lord. I didn't think it possible, but Evie really is working a transformation on you." Mrs. Pascoe chuckled softly, shaking her head. He thought about denying it, but the pleasure on his mother's face made him change his mind, so instead he leaned a little closer and said confidingly, "Please don't tell her. I'll never hear the end of it." His mother's laughter warmed him inside, and he was sure he could feel long atrophied muscles in his face trying to shift, trying to pull up the corners of his mouth. He didn't hate the feeling at all. It was a highly untraditional wedding, Evie mused, and probably a great deal more fun than her sister Sophie's would be, at least if Sophie's letters were anything to go by. Their mother appeared bound and determined to make it the dullest and most boring wedding imaginable, including burying Sophie alive in a mountain of frills, masquerading as a dress. Fond though Sophie was of her betrothed, it did not seem as though their marriage was going to begin auspiciously. By contrast, Evie's cousins and their respective new spouses were laughing uproariously, dancing and eating with great enjoyment and vigour, and generally having the time of their lives, while dressed in gorgeous new clothes that suited them perfectly. Evie could not help but sigh a little wistfully, thinking about how she had once dreamed of such a wedding for herself, even if the face of the groom had always been nebulous in her imagination. Glancing about the room, Evie's gaze fell upon Mrs. Pascoe, sitting watching the dancers and patting her hand on her leg in time with the music. She had no need of Evie to keep her company, however, as she was accompanied by several older ladies who had all drawn up chairs close by and seemed very eager to catch up with her, something which was making Mrs. Pascoe very happy, judging by the broad smile on her face. "Would you like to dance?" a deep voice said, a little hesitantly behind her, and Evie twisted around in her chair, startled. "Are you asking me if I'd like to dance with you, or is it just a general inquiry?" "With me." Gryff's mouth did that odd twitch thing again. "Can't help but notice you've only watched so far, but I see your foot tapping." "Nobody's asked," she admitted. "Not too many folks round here match your rank. Not that aren't already paired off, anyway." Gryff ducked his head slightly. "I don't either, really, but—" "I beg to disagree. You are a gentleman of property, Mr. Pascoe." She gave him a pert look. "And while my cousins might have Lord and Lady before their names, my father was a younger son, and I'm naught but a plain miss. Besides all of that, we're friends, and I should very much like to dance with my friend." Rising to her feet, she offered him her hand, and he took it on his arm and led her to join the dancers. Gryff felt even more tongue-tied than usual as Evie whirled gracefully about the floor in his arms. She looked the society diamond again today, in a golden silk gown with tiny crystals embroidered about the neckline, which caught every glint of light and made her shimmer as she moved. A strand of small but beautifully matched creamy pearls glowed softly at her throat. More pearls were threaded into her dark hair. Her eyes, though, in her eyes glinted mischief and laughter, and he could only see Evie, the first person in so many years who'd seen him and who wanted to be his friend. The woman he was falling hopelessly in love with. And it was hopeless, he knew that. For all her remarks that she was a spinster and on the shelf, she was far above his reach. It was an impossible dream to think that a woman like her would marry a man like him and settle down quietly on what amounted to no more than a large Cornish farm. She was meant for glittering ballrooms and promenades in Hyde Park, not whist in the evenings in his mother's parlour and rescuing sheep from briar patches. She deserved to be feted and adored and draped in jewels and silks, and all he could offer was the occasional excitement of pretending not to see the smuggling going on right under his nose. "You look grimmer than ever, Gryff," Evie said, and touched his arm, interrupting his glum thoughts. "Am I such poor company? Have I stepped on your toes?" She was teasing him, of course. She was light and graceful, and he doubted she'd ever done anything so clumsy as step on her dance partner's toes. He was far more likely to endanger hers, and said so. "Actually, I'm quite impressed." She glanced up at him through her lashes. "I'm guessing you refined your dance skills while in the military." Remarkable how many senior officers thought their subordinates' duties included squiring their wives around the dance floor, Gryff said, in a non-answer that answered her question perfectly. "Well, it was time well spent. You dance beautifully." "For a country bumpkin." Evie's mouth actually dropped open, and he thought he'd genuinely startled her. "Where did that come from? Is that what you think I—" "No, don't answer that. Quite clearly it is what you believe I think of you." "What utter nonsense, Gryffyn Pascoe!" She looked almost angry, and as the music came to a stop, he half thought she might turn and flounce away, which would be all for the best, really, as then she wouldn't be right in front of him, looking so beautiful she stole his breath. Instead, she moved around beside him and put her hand on his arm. "I'd like a glass of lemonade, and I think perhaps your mother would too. Escort me to the refreshment table, and we can take her some." "You're very thoughtful," he murmured, feeling a little ashamed of himself. "Thank you." "Your mother is a lovely lady who asks for very little. Certainly, she is far less demanding than my own mother, and she'd have far more cause. It's no trouble to do things for her." "That's how I feel about it. She thinks she's a burden, and I won't have it. I'm glad she decided she wanted to come today. It's because of you. Before you came to visit her, I don't think she'd have even considered it. So thank you. I should have encouraged her years ago to reach out to her family and old friends." "You've had other concerns." Evie gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "And your mother is a grown woman, capable of making her own decisions. All you need to do now is make it possible for her to do as she wishes. Offer the carriage to collect her friends and bring them to her whenever she wishes, for example. Perhaps look into some sort of portable rolling chair to make it easier for her to go on outings. I've seen them in London. I'm sure you could order one." "I should have done that a while ago," he murmured. "Thank you for understanding." They had come to the front of the line, where a footman was carefully ladling lemonade into glasses. Gryff handed one to Evie and placed his hand under her elbow to guide her to the side of the room. He wanted to ask her to dance again, but worried it might give rise to more speculation. Granny Smith had just walked past, grinning broadly at him and winking repeatedly. He ignored her determinedly. Really, he should walk away, but he couldn't make himself move. Even in the crowded room, the scent of Evie's hair had wafted to his nostrils, paralysing him in place as he desperately tried to inhale more of it, like a starving man with a feast laid before him. "What do you plan for Christmas?" Evie asked, surprising him. Gryff tried to think. Christmas was only a few days away now. He supposed the housekeeper and his mother would have made some efforts. "Because if you do not have significant plans, I think you and Mrs. Pascoe should come and spend Christmas here with us." He fairly gaped at her, and Evie actually blushed slightly. "I'm sure you think me impertinent, issuing invitations to a house which is not even my own, but my cousins have encouraged me to think of it as my home, and I know they will be glad to have more company. I do not like to think of just the two of you at Christmas, sitting at a quiet table. Say you will, Gryff. There is a lovely little parlour on the ground floor nobody ever uses. It would be easy to furnish it as a bedroom for your mother's convenience. We should truly love to have you with us. I will be especially grateful to have someone to talk to who is not a newlywed." "I could let most of our house staff have a holiday over Christmas to spend with their families," Gryff murmured thoughtfully. "We should not need to be back home until New Year's Day, perhaps, to begin preparing for Wassail night. Are you sure Lord Pencarrow would not mind? I think my mother would enjoy it very much." "Tobias will not mind at all, I promise." She hesitated, looking up at him, and then asked in a soft voice, "Will you enjoy it, Gryff? I think I have come to know you well enough now to understand that you will sacrifice your own comfort without thought to please the people you care about, but I want to know that you will take pleasure in our company." He didn't care about anyone's company but Evie's, and the thought of spending days in close company with her was irresistible, despite knowing he shouldn't. Knowing it could only lead to his heartbreak. "I cannot think of anything I would enjoy more," he admitted, with complete honesty. Chapter 8. Mrs. Pascoe was even more enthused than Gryff about the idea of spending Christmas at Pencarrow House, outwardly at least. And the very next day a note was delivered to Garth Avalon from Lord Pencarrow, formally reiterating Evie's invitation, so clearly Evie had not waited to approach her cousin on the matter. Gryff still had misgivings, mainly that he didn't quite know how he was going to survive several days under the same roof as Evie without doing something utterly foolish, like try to kiss her, or worse, propose. He still sat down and immediately wrote a polite note of acceptance, saying he and his mother would arrive at Pencarrow House on Christmas Eve and expected to make a stay of around 1 week. Then he had to ride down to Swain Cove and convince the dressmaker to pay a house call to Garth Avalon, as Mrs. Pascoe was in something of a tizzy, wanting a new gown or 3 to wear. "Gryffyn Pascoe," a voice greeted him as he came out of the dressmaker's shop, and he turned to find Granny Smith peering up at him. "Good day, Granny." He doffed his hat politely. "I hear you're caught in the Kernow lass now." Granny came straight to the point, as usual. "Probably best. She knows too much. Don't want her going back to London and talking about what she's seen here." "She'd never tell a soul anything, Granny." "She won't," Gryff corrected himself. "Even though she is going back to London. You're wrong. I'm not courting her." He'd said it all in the wrong order, flummoxed by Granny's accusation, not that she seemed to believe a word he'd said. "That's so. Danced with her yesterday, I heard, and spent the rest of the day staring at her like a love-struck fool." "She's not for the likes of me, Granny. Her sister's marrying one of the richest men in England, and there'll be lords aplenty falling over themselves for such a connection. Miss Kernow can have far more than a Cornish apple farm." "Perhaps she could," Granny allowed. "But does she want it, eh? You might think to check with her before you convince yourself of it." With a nod, the old woman continued on her way, bent over against the harsh wind blowing up from the cove, leaving Gryff standing alone and suddenly irresolute. "Over there, please, in front of the window." Evie pointed where she wanted the chaise being carried by 2 strapping footmen to be placed. "Oh, or maybe not. It might be too cold to sit there. Let me try it." She sat down briefly, long enough to feel the chill of the air on the back of her neck. "No, it's definitely too cold. Put that chest here instead, and take the chaise over to the other side of the fireplace, please." Abby had happily delegated the task of converting the unused downstairs parlour to a bedroom for Mrs. Pascoe's use to Evie, and she threw herself into the task with enthusiasm, claiming items of furniture she thought might suit from all over the house. "Not that table. It's going to make the room too cluttered. Take it back, please. Sorry, William," she called to the long-suffering footman. The staff were all thoroughly under her spell, though, and the man just smiled and nodded before turning around again. "And not that rug. It looks lovely, but I worry it might catch on the wheels of Mrs. Pascoe's chair." "Right you are, Miss Evie." The rug was rolled up and promptly removed, and Evie stood back to look around the room. The furnishings she'd had brought in were well made and sturdy, nothing liable to fall over or move if accidentally nudged by a wheeled chair. Without rugs on the floor, the wooden floor did look a little dark and dull, but it was unavoidable, and there were other ways to brighten the room. "Some greenery in a vase on the window-sill," she requested of one of the maids. "And perhaps a colourful shawl to drape over the chaise?" "I'll see what I can find, Miss Evie." "You've gone to a lot of effort," someone murmured behind her, and she looked around to find Tobias leaning in the doorframe, looking at her thoughtfully. "I want Mrs. Pascoe to be comfortable. It will surely be difficult for her to be away from home and all her familiar things. Let us make things as convenient for her as we can." "Anything you need, it is at your disposal." Tobias shrugged amiably. "What about a room for Gryff?" "I'm sure the housekeeper has that well in hand." Evie could feel the blush staining her cheeks at the lie. She'd chosen the guest chamber herself and asked the housekeeper to air it out and put fresh linens on the bed, before selecting some books she thought Gryff might like from the library and stacking them on a table by the bed. Tobias looked a little cynical. "I've been meaning to talk to you, Evie. Do you have a few minutes? I'm sure the maids can finish up in here before the Pascoes arrive." She nodded, following him to the study, where her cousin closed the door and gestured her to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs he'd had placed near the fire, where she knew he and Hiram regularly liked to sit together in the evenings. "I know you must go back to London for Sophie's wedding," Tobias said. "But, Evie, we would like it very much if you would come back to Cornwall afterwards and make your home with us." Evie hesitated, unbearably tempted. She'd found a contentment living at Pencarrow House, such as she'd never known in her whole life. She fit, in a way she knew she never would in London. She also knew that she wouldn't be able to bear living so close to Gryff, loving him and never having him. "That is very kind of you, Tobias," she said, trying to keep her voice light and casual. "But I do think I had best go home. My mother will likely want me at her side once Sophie is married and gone." Tobias gave her a penetrating stare, but he didn't press, instead rising to his feet and going to open the door again. "The invitation stands, should you ever change your mind, Evie," he said quietly as she passed him, and she paused to squeeze his hand and thank him. The sound of carriage wheels outside made her turn towards the front door, and in just moments Gryff was entering, his mother carried in his arms, until he was able to place her in the wheeled chair one of the footmen was standing ready with in the hallway. "Is that snow?" Evie asked, seeing white flakes on Gryff's shoulders. "It is indeed, just started." He nodded to her, the corner of his mouth doing that little twitchy thing she was coming to think of as his version of a smile. "Won't last long, I think. Not today, but there'll be more coming." "Some farmer's sense for it, have you?" she teased lightly. "Not me, but the old shepherd who supervises my flock." He has a bad leg he swears you can tell the weather by, and he's not wrong often enough for me to doubt the truth of it." Evie laughed, amused by his deadpan delivery, and bent to kiss Amanda Pascoe's cheek. "Let me show you to your room, Mrs. Pascoe. I think you'll like what we've done with it for you." Mrs. Pascoe had brought her own maid, a sturdy girl named Helen, who was familiar with all her mistress's special needs, and both of them looked around the converted parlour with approving nods.
"Why, this is lovely, Evie. How much trouble you have all gone to. Thank you."
Mrs. Pascoe reached to grasp her hand, squeezing her fingers lightly.
"I've no doubt I shall be very comfortable here.
If there is anything at all you want, please don't hesitate to ask. Some of the staff haven't been here long. Tobias is still working on staffing the house appropriately, but they are all so very helpful and obliging. I know they'll make you welcome, Helen."
"Oh, the maid said cheerfully. "My cousin Nell works in the kitchens, don't she?"
"Of course." Evie was still getting used to how everyone in Swain Cove seemed to be related to everyone else in some degree. It should be no surprise that servants in neighbouring households were family. "Well, I'll leave you to get settled. If Helen would like to bring you to the parlour in a half-hour or so, tea will be served, and I know Mrs. Morrow has made some wonderful cakes for the occasion."
"Lovely, my dear."
Mrs. Pascoe squeezed her hand again before letting go. "I'll show you to your room," Evie said to Gryff, who had stood quietly in the doorway watching as his mother and Helen explored the room. He nodded wordlessly and moved back for her to pass, politely gesturing for her to precede him. "You're actually directly above your mother's room," Evie said, as she led Gryff up the stairs. "It's not the largest guest room, but—" "I'm sure it'll be fine," he muttered gruffly.
"Well, here you are."
She stopped at a door, turned the handle to push it open, a slight flush rising to her cheeks.
"I won't come in?"
He paused and looked at her for a long moment, his jaw working briefly as though he was about to say something, but then he appeared to think better of it, and just nodded before going into the room and closing the door firmly behind him. It shouldn't have felt as though he was shutting her out of his life entirely, but somehow that was exactly what it felt like, and Evie went back down the stairs, fighting down tears that threatened to fall. Gryff leaned back against the door and knocked his head against it gently, wishing he could knock some sense into his thick skull, but when Evie looked up at him like that, it was all he could do not to grab her and kiss her senseless. The mere thought of her in his room, in proximity with a bed, had him unable to get so much as a word out. His day was only going to get worse. When he descended the stairs a little while later, feeling a little more composed and realizing he should join the ladies for their tea, he found Tobias on a ladder in the hall. "What are you doing?" Gryff asked with some amusement, watching as Tobias reached out to tie some greenery to one of the rafters. "Oh, wait. Is that?" "Mistletoe," Tobias confirmed with a nod. "Abby insisted I hang some. Can't imagine who she thinks might want to catch someone under it for a kiss, mind you." He stared pointedly at Gryff. "Neither can I," Gryff snapped gruffly, and stalked past Tobias, heading for the parlour. He could really do without Swain Cove's matchmakers trying to throw Evie at his head. It was far too tempting to try and catch her.
Chapter 9. "Do I smell bad?"
Abby stared at Evie.
"What?"
"Do I smell bad?" Evie repeated. "Because I can't think of any other reason why Gryff is trying so hard to avoid me. I'm sure I haven't said anything to offend him. And if I have, I've said worse, and he didn't refuse to look at me, as he has for the last 5 days. Abby covered her mouth with her hand, obviously unsuccessfully trying to smother a laugh. "You don't smell," she mumbled through her fingers, tiny snorts and snickers escaping. "And that mistletoe was a stupid idea," Evie continued, barely listening to her cousin. "I can't tell you how many times I've lurked underneath it, and he's avoiding it like the plague.
I even got Hiram to bring in another bunch to put up, and Griff spotted it and jolly well ran away." Evie knew she sounded utterly pathetic. Abby's valiant attempts not to laugh only proved it. She folded her arms with a humph. "He just doesn't want to kiss me. I should accept it and move on." "Oh, Evie." Abby was still snickering, but she reached out and patted Evie's shoulder kindly. "I'm pretty sure it's not that he doesn't want to kiss you. I suspect it's that he wants to kiss you too much." "That doesn't make any sense," Evie grumbled. "And they're leaving to go home tomorrow, and then I have to go back to London in a few days' time. All I wanted was one kiss." "I think you wanted a lot more than one kiss," Abby said, not unkindly. "But I'm afraid Griff, well, he's not the marrying kind. You can say it. I'm not going to cry." Evie was not going to cry. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. "I just wanted one kiss under the mistletoe," she said finally, once she was confident her voice wasn't going to wobble. "That's all." She had to turn and walk away then, because Abby was giving her a look full of pity, and Evie didn't want to be pitied. She wanted to be kissed, damn it. Just once, by the only man she'd ever even remotely been attracted to, before she had to go back to London and try to forget him. And she wanted him to make an effort and bloody well smile. She was going to fail in her mission to make him smile and lose that stupid wager to Abby, and then she'd have to go back to London and try and remain as unobtrusive as possible in her stepfather's house until Sophie had a baby, and then she'd go and live with Sophie and help with her children and be the old maiden aunt of the family. Evie didn't realise she'd lost control until she tasted salt. She should have left the room, she thought as she stared out of the window, desperately trying to pull herself together. She was stuck now, as if she turned around to go to the door, someone would see her tears, and she'd have to answer questions she really didn't want to. "Evie," a deep voice said quietly at her shoulder, and she sucked in a ragged breath. "Are you all right?" "Oh, fine," she said, determinedly not looking at Griff. "Why wouldn't I be? It's been such a lovely Christmas." It really had been. Despite Griff keeping his distance until this very moment, what appalling timing the man had, she'd had a wonderful time. "There are literally tears running down your cheeks." A hand moved into her blurry field of vision, a clean white handkerchief held in it. "I'm just thinking how sorry I am to be leaving." It wasn't quite the truth, but it was a truth, so Evie ran with it. Accepting Griff's handkerchief, she wiped at her face. "I have felt more at home here, more welcome, than I ever have in my life. I will miss you all." "We will miss you too," he said quietly. "Will you?" Knowing she probably looked a fright, with red-rimmed eyes and swollen nose, Evie had never been a pretty crier, she turned and looked up at him. "Will you miss me, Griff?" He seemed to hesitate, take a small step backward, and then looked at her face again. "Yes," he said. "Very much." Now or never, Evie thought, plucking up all her courage. "Will you kiss me under the mistletoe?" she blurted out. Griff's expression devolved to pure shock, his mouth dropping open. "What?" "Just once. I'd really like to be kissed under the mistletoe. I never have been. Please?" He glanced around, expression slightly hunted, obviously wondering if anyone had overheard their conversation. Nobody was close enough, though, and he looked back at Evie. His expression softened, and he startled her by saying, "Yes, if you really want me to. But not when we might be seen. I'd not want anyone gossiping about you." Startled, she struggled to catch her breath for a moment. "When?" she managed to say at last. "Tonight, after dinner. Slip away from the other ladies in the parlour, and I'll leave the gentlemen in the library. We'll meet in the hall, under the mistletoe." Evie was on tenterhooks for the rest of the day.
Never had the minutes seemed to crawl by so slowly. Every time she glanced at the clock on the mantel, the hands seemed scarcely to have moved at all. Even dinner, normally a lively meal, felt dragging and dull due to her utter inability to pay attention to what anyone was saying. Everyone had noticed her distraction, which at least gave her a good excuse to leave the other ladies in the parlour after dinner, saying, "I am poor company this evening, I fear. If you will excuse me, I think I will take to my bed with a book." "Of course," Mrs. Pascoe said at once, patting her hand. "I have noticed you've not been quite yourself today, dear. Get your maid to bring you a nice hot posset and have a good night's sleep." Evie hated herself for telling the fib to the older woman, who she'd quickly become very fond of, but certainly she knew she would not be able to walk back into the parlour and pretend nothing had happened after kissing Gryff. So she bent to embrace Mrs. Pascoe before bidding Evie and Zip good night and slipping out of the room. Gryff was already in the hall, standing in the shadows of the doorway that led below stairs, obviously listening to check if anyone approached. He closed the door quietly when he saw Evie coming, moving forward to meet her in the middle of the hall. "This feels so awkward now," Evie mumbled, aware her cheeks were bright red. She'd done some outrageous things in London, but sneaking away to meet a man under the mistletoe was far beyond any of them. "You can always back out," Gryff said, his tone gentle. "Or I can just give you a peck on the cheek and we'll call it done, but you implied you wanted more than that." "More than a peck on the cheek, yes. A proper kiss." She sneaked a glance up at him through her lashes. "I've never been kissed." "I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Clearly, London is full of idiots." One big hand came up, his fingertips brushing her cheek in a whisper-soft caress. "Yes," she agreed deliriously, swaying closer to him. "Not that I'm much smarter," she heard Gryff mutter under his breath, and then both his hands were on her face, framing it gently, and his lips came down to meet hers. The kiss was everything Evie had dreamed of for so long, since before she even knew Gryff, since her earliest girlish dreams of some nebulous, handsome knight who would sweep her off her feet and kiss her tenderly until she swooned. She didn't quite swoon, but she did have to clutch at Gryff for support as her knees went a little weak, and he let go of her face and curved his arms around her without ever breaking the kiss. Finally, he lifted his head and, looking down at her, shook it slowly. "Ah, Evie," he said softly. She stared, because along with the words his lips were shifting, changing shape, curving up at the corners. "You're smiling," she whispered, incredulous. "You really can smile." "A man who couldn't smile after a kiss like that would be a dead man," Gryff said, with something that sounded almost like a chuckle, stunning her further. "So that's all I had to do to get you to smile? Kiss you?" "You'll be the bloody death of me, woman." He was definitely laughing, soft chortles, his broad chest shaking under her hands as she still held on to the front of his jacket. "Nobody saw it but me," Evie lamented. "It won't count." "You'll win your bet, Evie girl. I'll smile at you before Wassail night. I promise. Now you'd better run along before we get caught and your cousin gets offended on your behalf." He swooped back down to give her another quick kiss, though, before letting go of her and stepping back. "I hope your first kiss under the mistletoe was satisfactory." There are quite a few words I can think of to describe it, and satisfactory isn't one I would have chosen. She grinned as his eyes widened and he looked a little concerned. Incredible might be closer. And with a giddy little laugh, she turned and hurried away up the stairs before she did anything silly like throw herself at him and beg him to kiss her some more. Chapter 10. Incredible came pretty close indeed, Gryff thought, as he watched Evie dart up the stairs, her feet barely making a sound as she went. He felt rocked to his core by what had just happened. All day, his conscience had been screaming at him that this was a terrible idea, that kissing Evie could not possibly lead anywhere good for either of them. The temptation had proved to be too much, though, and Gryff had told himself it was nothing. Evie was hardly the first girl he'd kissed under the mistletoe. He wanted her to be the last, though. Wanted to kiss her, and only her, under the mistletoe and everywhere else. She was bound for London in just a few days, and his dreams would come to naught. Better to forget them now. He just had the sinking feeling that Evie wasn't the kind of woman he was ever going to be able to forget. "Pascoe," a voice said behind him, and he turned to see Tobias leaning in the doorway to the library. "Fancy a game of billiards? Hiram's terrible at it." "I'm not much for it, but I'll give you a game," Gryff admitted, hoping Lord Pencarrow hadn't been standing there too long. Hadn't seen any of his interactions with Evie. The last thing Gryff wanted was Evie being pressured into marrying him because of a mere kiss under the mistletoe, not that he thought her cousin likely to do such a thing. To his mind, there was nothing more certain than to make a marriage miserable if one or more parties were pressured into it against their will. Fortunately, Tobias said nothing and gave no indication that he might have seen them together. He just passed Gryff a cue and gestured for him to perform the first lag, so that they might determine who would break the game. Leaving Pencarrow House, leaving Evie the following morning, was actively painful for Gryff. Evie did not come down to see them off, which stung until it occurred to him that his leaving might be a little painful for her too. Her tears last night certainly seemed to indicate it might be. "Thank you so much for your kind invitation," Mrs. Pascoe addressed Lord Pencarrow. "I cannot recall a happier Christmas." "It has been a genuine pleasure." Tobias bent to kiss her cheek. "We shall hope to see you regularly at Pencarrow House, now you are out and about again." "And you to Garth Avalon, once a month at least to dinner. I am quite determined." She glanced at Gryff, who nodded in agreement. He enjoyed the company of Pencarrow and his sister, and their respective spouses. Even with Evie gone, he'd still be pleased to spend time with them. Even if Evie would be on his mind every time he saw them. "We'll see you at Wassail night," Tobias said, as Gryff lifted his mother into the carriage. "Let me know if there's anything you need extra staff for. I'm sure we could spare a couple of people. We'll have the carts from the farm with the horses harnessed to ferry people back and forth from the village, of course. That'll be plenty, what with everyone else with a horse and cart doing the same. It's a bit of a walk on a cold night otherwise. We'll feel the chill less on the way back with plenty of hot cider wassail in our bellies," Tobias chortled. "Aye up, so long as nobody takes the cliff path and falls off." There would be no smugglers about, at least. Wassail night was a tradition everyone took seriously, and even the gentlemen would be taking the night off. "What a delightful visit," his mother said with a little sigh as the carriage began to move, the driver handling the horses carefully on the frosty ground. "I shall be glad to be back in my own bed again, though, I must admit." "Amen to that," her maid Helen muttered, and flushed when Gryff looked at her. "Not that the staff at Pencarrow House weren't very nice to me, of course, and very accommodating to Mrs. Pascoe's needs. But there's nothing like your own bed." "I suppose I spent too many nights sleeping rough with the army," Gryff murmured. "Any kind of bed feels like luxury after the hard ground and a thin blanket." "True enough." His mother shook her head. "Do you miss the army, Gryff?" she asked suddenly. "I've never asked you, but you did run away from home to join up and refused to come back when your father found you. You must have enjoyed it." They hadn't ever really talked about it, and he wasn't about to tell her the truth now, that he'd run away desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere his father had created and determinedly sustained. He'd been a boy who had known nothing of the greater world's cruelty. "I didn't enjoy it precisely," he said after a moment. "But I was good at it, and I found a camaraderie with my fellow soldiers which I did like. I miss that a little, but it's the only thing about the army I do miss. I'm happy to be home, and more than content to live out my life in our little corner of Cornwall."
"With a good woman to settle down with?" Amanda asked slyly, and from the corner of his eye, Griff saw Helen grin.
"Maybe one day," he said flatteningly. "If I ever meet someone suited to the life we lead."
His mother opened her mouth again, and Griff held up his hand to stop her.
"Please don't, ma'am. I know what you have on your mind, and I might have held hopes in that direction briefly, but she's not for the likes of me."
"Griff," Amanda said softly, "did you ask her?"
"She's not for the likes of me, so just drop it," he said, perhaps a little more forcefully than he meant to, but it had the desired result.
His mother fell silent, though he saw her exchange glances with Helen, and both women shook their heads, identical pursed-lipped looks in his direction, telling him clearly that he was in their black books. They said nothing more, though, and he exhaled, turning to stare out the window, though he didn't see the scenery passing by outside as they climbed the hill to Garth Avalon. All he could see was Evie's face, the look in her eyes after he'd kissed her. Evie Kernow was going to haunt his dreams for a long, long time, he suspected, but he couldn't bring himself to regret a moment of it. A smile curved his mouth as he thought of her, gazing out of the window. Is he smiling?" he heard Helen whisper, shocked. "Oh, Griff," Amanda murmured. "My dear boy."
"It's all right, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'm all right."
"Here we come a-wassailing, among the leaves so green, here we come a-wandering, so fair to be seen. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too, and God bless you and send you a happy new year, and God send you a happy new year. Our wassail cup is made of the rosemary tree, and so is your beer of the best barley." "Wait, aren't we asking for cider?" Evie interrupted Abby's singing. "Why is the song about beer? Do you want to learn the words or not?" Abby scowled at her. "I don't know why it's about beer. We ask for mouldy cheese and Christmas loaf in the 5th verse." "5 verses?" Evie blew out her cheeks. "You should have started teaching me this weeks ago, not the day we're going wassailing." "I'm sorry." Abby squeezed her hand. "It just didn't occur to me that you wouldn't know it. Everyone knows it. Everyone who grew up in Cornwall, whereas I didn't set foot here until a few weeks ago. But it feels like you're one of us." The simple words warmed Evie's heart, and she immediately forgave her cousin for not thinking to teach her the song. "Go back to the start. If I know at least the first verse and the refrain, I can mouth my way through the rest." Abby grinned and began again, and Evie hummed along, determined to master the tune. They were due to leave in a few minutes, and she was currently bundling up in her warmest clothes with 2 pairs of stockings and a thick wool cloak Abby had lent her over top of it all. The evening promised to be bitterly cold, but apparently nothing could be permitted to get in the way of the wassail tradition. The whole of Swain Cove appeared to be on the move, heading for Garth Avalon. Abby explained, as the Pencarrow coach followed a slow farm cart up the lane, that in some parts of Cornwall folk tramped from one farm to the other, but here in Swain Cove it was long established that the cider house at Garth Avalon was the centre of festivities. A huge bonfire was lit, hot cider bestowed liberally, and food supplied for all the revellers. "So when do we sing?" Evie asked, leaning forward and peering up the hill. An orange glow in the sky pointed the way to the bonfire. "Whenever you want more cider," Abby giggled. She was in a merry mood this evening, holding hands with Zip, who was now very pregnant, but had flatly refused to be left out of the festivities this evening. "And will there be mouldy cheese and Christmas loaf too?" "All sorts of good things to eat, I hope. I'm starving," Tobias said from the other side of the carriage. "Did we bring something? Is that how it works? Otherwise it seems like a lot of impost on the Pascoes to feed everyone and provide the cider too." "The kitchen sent a whole cartload of food over earlier," Abby chuckled.
A whole spit-roasted pig, about 40 loaves of bread, and enough cake to feed every sweet-toothed child in Swain Cove for a week, it looked like. And most of our servants to help out, too. Didn't you notice that we only had soup for luncheon, and there was only one maid? Evie really hadn't. She'd been so excited about the evening, she'd barely paid attention to anything all day. She honestly couldn't recall ever having felt so excited about anything, not her debut ball, not even as a child on Christmas morning. It was the thought of seeing Gryff again for the first time since their kiss that had her stomach swooping about like a falcon hunting field mice she knew. "We'll get no closer," Tobias said a few minutes later, and the coach driver called the same out. "Come on, let's get out, and John can take the horses back to the warm stables. He'll call back for us later." Hiram and Tobias helped Zip down, then Evie and Abby, and the 5 of them progressed up the hill, past people clambering down from carts, talking and laughing excitedly in the darkness. The men were carrying lanterns, which Evie was grateful for. The ground was rough, and she knew she would have tripped more than once without being able to see her footing. The bonfire came into view, the cider house a huge dark shadow behind it, the doors flung wide open, and trestle tables heaped with food visible inside. "Come on!" Tugging on Evie's hand, Abby pulled her past the bonfire into the cider house and over to where a maid was dipping warm spiced cider from a huge bowl into cups. "Time to sing!" The cider was delicious, Evie thought, as she sipped from her cup and walked about, sampling foods pressed upon her and greeting friendly faces she'd met during her time in Swain Cove. She didn't see Gryff anywhere, though she did see Mrs. Pascoe, ensconced in a corner in her chair swathed in blankets, surrounded by older women chattering away enthusiastically to her. "Thank you, yes," she said to a young lad who offered up a plate of pastries for her to have one. "What's in them?" "Apples, of course," he said with a laugh. "Of course." She took one and thanked him again, bit into the warm, buttery pastry, and hummed with pleasure at the taste. Walking outside, nibbling the last of her pastry, Evie startled as a group of children tore past her laughing loudly, and almost stumbled as her heel caught on the hem of Abby's cloak, a little too long for her. "Easy," a warm voice murmured in her ear, strong hands catching her waist to steady her. "Gryff!" She would have known his voice anywhere. Whirling, she smiled up at him. "I was wondering where you were." "Keeping an eye on things out here." He gestured vaguely beyond the bonfire. "Making sure nobody's out there who oughtn't be." What would they be doing out there? Evie frowned in puzzlement. "That's the apple orchard over there, isn't it? There won't be any apples on the trees now." "No." His lips twitched a little. "Folks go into the orchard for, a little privacy. Couples," he clarified, when Evie still looked blank. "Oh. Oh!" She flushed bright red. "My goodness! Isn't that rather cold?" He was definitely smirking now. "They keep each other warm." Evie had to put her hands to her cheeks, burning even hotter. "Gryff!" "Want to try it?" She did. Without hesitation, she took his offered hand and followed him into the darkness beyond the bonfire. Chapter 11. Gryff couldn't quite believe what he was doing, leading Evie off into the orchard on Wassail night. She was laughing, an excited, nervous laugh, which stopped as he turned to face her, backing her up against the trunk of one of the apple trees. He could just barely make out her face, a smooth oval in the moonlight filtering through the tree's winter-bare branches as she looked up at him. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said, almost inaudibly. "I know," Gryff muttered gruffly. "But tonight you're here, and I want to kiss you again." She reached up then, put her arms around his neck. "Kiss me like there's no tomorrow then," she whispered, and he lowered his head and obeyed. They broke apart when someone shouted close by. "Mary! Mary! I saw you sneak off with Tom Lassiter!" "Oh, Lord," Gryff sighed, and leaned his forehead against Evie's briefly. "That's John Penhaligon looking for his sister. I'd best go break it up before he and Lassiter come to blows over her again." "That's what you meant by people who shouldn't be sneaking off together?" Evie asked. I don't judge what consenting adults do together, but Mary Penhaligon's only 15, and she's lost her head over Lassiter. We don't need fights on Wassail night, because a grown man's fool enough to take what a girl that young's offering." Gently he kissed her brow. "Go back to the gathering, Evie. Stay close to the fire, and don't be wandering off with anyone else."
"As if I would,"
she said indignantly. He didn't say what he was thinking, that soon enough she'd be back in London, having her head turned by any number of eager beaux, far more suited to court a woman of her station than he ever could be. "I must go."
"Gryff, wait."
Evie caught at his sleeve.
Will I see you again?"
He couldn't make her any promises. He had responsibilities tonight, and tomorrow she'd be gone, and likely enough, if he ever did see her again, it would be when she and whatever lord she married came to visit her cousins at Pencarrow House. Something Gryff didn't think he could bear, as the mere thought of it twisted in his gut like a blade. So instead of answering, he tilted her chin up with his fingertips, bent down, and kissed her tenderly once more. "Goodbye, Evie," he said quietly, and walked away into the night. 200 miles of wet winter roads later, Evie stepped wearily down from the carriage and walked up the steps of her stepfather's Mayfair townhouse. Goatley held the door open for her with a welcoming smile. "Good to see you home, Miss Evie."
"Are my mother and Sophie here?"
"No, Miss Evie, they're out shopping. Some last-minute things for Miss Sophie's trousseau, I believe."
"Of course."
Truth be told, Evie was a little relieved. She wanted nothing more than to sink into a hot bath and soak her weary, aching bones. It had been a miserably exhausting journey, though thankfully about 3 days in she had finally run out of tears over Gryff and spent the rest of the time staring emptily into the constantly falling rain. "Are you feeling quite all right, Miss Evie?" Goatley said, startling her, and then she realised she had been just standing there in the hallway, unmoving.
"I am tired. And pleased to be home," she added, dredging up a smile somehow.
She felt like Gryff, like her facial muscles had forgotten how to smile. The expression felt entirely unnatural. "Is everything going to remind me of him?" she wondered, as she dragged her feet up the stairs.
"Evie!"
The shriek made her turn, and then Sophie was racing up the stairs to throw her arms around her sister.
"Oh, Soph!"
Evie embraced her back, and then, to her horror, discovered that she hadn't in fact run out of tears after all, as she dissolved into sobs on her sister's shoulder. Thankfully, her mother and sister wrote her tears off as her being overwrought and exhausted from the journey, because she didn't know how to explain she'd fallen hopelessly in love with a taciturn Cornishman who wasn't interested in marriage, without entirely scandalising them. Somehow, Evie got through the following days by focusing on her sister's upcoming nuptials. Sophie was blissfully happy, and their mother was in her element organising a magnificent wedding. There were 1,000,001 things to do, and more than enough to keep Evie busy, though Gryff was never far from her thoughts. It was the evening before the wedding when Evie found herself sitting with Sophie, brushing her sister's hair out to dry it after her bath, the pair of them finally alone.
"You have barely said anything about Cornwall,
Evie," Sophie said into the quiet room, startling Evie.
"Which is not like you, because you do like to chatter about adventures. So I feel like something happened there you don't want to talk about."
Evie's hand stilled for a moment, and then she resumed her brushing.
"Nothing of any lasting consequence," she said finally. "And this is not a night to talk about me, Soph. You're the one getting married tomorrow. Are you nervous?" "Nervous? Why should I be?"
Sophie turned to smile at Evie over her shoulder.
"I adore Sir Eric, And he me. Well, everything. Getting married in front of half the ton, the snobbier half at that.
Evie nudged Sophie gently.
The wedding night?
Sophie giggled.
I'm not worried about the wedding night. Eric promised me everything will be fine, and Mamma says there is nothing to worry about. She says half the tales about awful wedding nights are made up to frighten young women out of doing anything they shouldn't before the wedding.
That sounded quite plausible, actually, Evie mused as Sophie went on.
And Mamma has everything so well under control. All I have to do is let the maids dress me and turn up at the church.
I wish I had half your confidence, Evie murmured as she set the brush aside at last.
You?
Sophie half laughed, turning to face her properly.
You're the most confident person I know. When have you ever let anyone's opinion of you stop you from doing exactly what you want?
Evie stared at her.
Take after the wedding, for example. You're not going to let Mother boss you around, are you? Now you don't have me and my reputation to worry about, you'll be back doing exactly as you please.
I have to obey some rules, Evie disagreed, at least if I want to keep living here.
You needn't even do that.
Sophie laughed gaily.
You shall come and live with Sir Eric and I if you wish it. I would be delighted. You're about to leave for Italy on your honeymoon, and on your return I think your new husband will prefer to have you all to himself, for a while at least,
Evie disagreed.
Well, you could go back to Cornwall then. You seem to be enjoying yourself well enough from your letters. I'm sure your cousins would be happy to have you. Unless there's some reason you don't want to go back,
Sophie probed, and Evie realised her sister wasn't going to stop until she had ferreted out the truth. His name is Gryff, she admitted finally. But please, please don't tell Mamma. Marriage wouldn't be an option. Sophie's eyes went very wide.
Is he already married? She asked, obviously scandalised.
No, nothing like that. He's just not the marrying kind. Tears welled again, and Evie fought them down determinedly. I've never been in love before, Soph, she confessed. And unfortunately, I'm not as lucky as you. I'm just going to have to get myself over a broken heart and move on.
Oh, Evie.
Sophie reached out, pulling her into a hug.
He's an idiot, Sophie said vehemently into her ear, if he can't see how perfectly wonderful you are and snap you up. He doesn't deserve you.
Evie allowed herself to sink into her sister's comforting embrace for a few moments before sniffing, straightening up and pulling back. Never mind that fool of a man. I don't want to think about him any more. Tonight is about you, sweetie. Tell me more about the itinerary Sir Eric has planned for your honeymoon. The ship will take you first to Florence, is that right?
No, silly.
Sophie laughed a little.
Florence isn't on the coast. We go first to Naples, and from there we shall go to Rome, which Sir Eric insists is the most beautiful city in the entire world.
Evie determinedly pasted on her newly false smile again, sitting back against the pillows and listening as her sister waxed rhapsodic about how wonderful her life was going to be. She did not begrudge Sophie her happiness. She would not. But she couldn't help but wish for just a little bit of happiness for herself. She didn't need a grand wedding at St. George's on Hanover Square before half the ton, or a rich husband with a magnificent country estate, or a honeymoon in Italy. A gruff Cornishman with an apple orchard and sheep to rescue from briar patches would be more than enough for Evie, but it seemed even that was too much to ask. Chapter 12.
You look quite nice, dear, Mrs. Hallidon said, almost sounding surprised. Though I cannot conceive how you managed to get something of a tan in Cornwall in the winter time.
I took a lot of long walks and rides, Evie said. The Cornish sea air was invigorating. She missed it desperately already. London smelled even worse than she remembered.
Well, ensure you keep your bonnet on, and hopefully nobody will notice your freckles.
Determined to cause no conflict on Sophie's wedding day, Evie smiled around gritted teeth and nodded submissively.
Mr. Marshall Harris is here, her mother said, in an apparent non sequitur. We have seen him a few times about town. He asked after you. He's a 50-year-old widower who wants someone to manage his 6 rambunctious children, Evie said tartly. And he's too cheap to hire a decent governess and a tutor for them, so he's looking for a patient wife. Which would definitely not be me. I'm on the shelf by choice, Mother, remember? I've turned down better prospects than Mr. Marshall Harris.
Was all her mother said, and Evie had the sinking feeling that her mother planned to redouble her efforts to marry Evie off, now Sophie was safely off her hands. The wedding had been beautiful, Sophie a radiant bride, and Sir Eric looking scarcely able to believe his good fortune. A select group of guests were now gathered at the Hallidon townhouse for a discreet celebration of the nuptials. Evie and her mother happened to be standing close by the door to the parlour when Evie overheard a sudden commotion in the hallway outside.
"Yes, I have an invitation," a deep, startlingly familiar voice said. "Right here. See?"
"Lord Pencarrow?" Goatley asked doubtfully.
"That's me."
That was most definitely not Tobias's voice. Evie turned towards the door in disbelief. It couldn't be Gryff out there.
"Oh, your cousin has decided to attend after all," Mrs. Hallidon said. "A shame he arrived too late for the church ceremony."
"I don't think that's Tobias," Evie began, and then the door opened and Gryff entered the room. His eyes met hers, and he smiled, startling her even further.
"That's not Lord Pencarrow," Mrs. Hallidon cried. "What is the meaning of this? Who are you?"
Gryff ignored her completely and strode forward, coming to a halt in front of Evie before dropping to one knee. "Gryff," she whispered, still scarcely able to believe it was really him. What are you doing here?"
"You'd barely left when I realized letting you go was the biggest mistake I've ever made," he said. "I wrote you 5 letters in 3 days, but none of them could convey what I wanted to say, so I couldn't post any of them. I didn't know where to find you, so I went to see Tobias. He was kind enough to give me his invitation to the wedding, said I could use it to reach you."
"Evie?" Sophie and her new husband had arrived at her side now. "Is this—" "Gryffyn Pascoe," she said numbly. "The Pencarrow's neighbour."
"Whatever you are doing, young man, I don't think this is an appropriate venue for it," Mrs. Hallidon said frostily.
"Yes, come, man," Sir Eric said, his tone kindly. "Let us go into the study, and I shall pour you a brandy. You're kind, but I cannot wait another minute to say what I must. I've already waited too long." Gryff had never taken his eyes from Evie's face. "Will you hear me out, Evie?" "Yes," she whispered, hardly daring to hope. "From the moment we met, you have challenged me to be a better version of myself. And I am better, for knowing you, for having your friendship. I don't know if I'm a good enough man to be worthy of you, whether I ever can be, but I will spend the rest of my life trying, if you will have me." "Oh," Sophie whispered, into a room so quiet one could have heard a pin drop. "That is the most romantic thing I've ever heard in my life."
"Will you marry me, Evie Kernow? I can't offer this."
Gryff gestured around the opulently furnished room at the elegantly clothed guests, all staring at him.
"You know what I have to offer. Garth Avalon is not much, but it is yours, as is my heart."
"I would take your heart even if it came without Garth Avalon," Evie cried, finding her voice at last. "Yes, Gryff, 1,000 times yes." He surged to his feet and flung his arms around her. Sophie let out a squeal of delight and clapped her hands together, and the entire room erupted with noise.
"What is happening?"
Mrs. Hallidon cried dismally.
"Whoever is this? Evie, you cannot possibly be. Oh, my lord, now she's kissing him."
"I think the study is definitely the best place for this," Sir Eric said hastily, grasping Griff's shoulder. "Come now, let us make this just family." Mr. Hallidon had by now made his way across the room to join them, scowling blackly. "Who in the world is this?" he barked.
"He's the man Evie fell in love with in Cornwall," Sophie said excitedly. "And obviously he's realised that he can't live without her, and he's come all this way to ask her to marry him."
"You must be Sophie," Gryff said, as he allowed Sir Eric to steer him across the hallway to the study, though he did not loose the arm he had wrapped around Evie's waist. "Evie told me so much about you."
"I wish I could say the same, but about all she told me about you is that you weren't the marrying kind," Sophie said pertly, which was clearly incorrect.
"In Evie's defence, she was correct," Gryff disagreed. "But losing her is a thought so unacceptable, I realised I had already changed. Where she is concerned, I'm very much the marrying kind." "Who exactly are you?" Mr. Hallidon demanded. "And why is it that you think you can come into my house under false pretences and propose to my daughter?"
"Stepdaughter," Evie corrected. "And this is Mr. Gryffyn Pascoe, who I am going to marry. Since I'm over the age of majority, and you have never proposed to offer me a dowry, I do not think you can have anything to say on the matter, sir." Sir Eric actually laughed, which raised him even further in Evie's estimation. She turned her head to give him a small smile, and he offered a polite little bow. "Sir Eric Fitzwalter, Mr. Pascoe. It seems we are to be brothers by marriage, so I should like to be the first to welcome you to the family." "Thank you. I appreciate that." Gryff gave him a smile, one which looked so natural Evie couldn't help but stare. "Have you been practising smiling?" she whispered to Gryff, as her stepfather huffed and muttered, and her mother tried to soothe his ruffled feathers. "Can't help but smile now I'm back with you again, Evie girl." He squeezed her hand. "You'll really marry me? I'm feeling terrible now for putting you on the spot in front of all those people." "Oh, you're not backing out now?" Evie grinned up at him. "You did ask me in front of all those people. If you back out now, I shall sue for breach of promise." Gryff threw his head back and laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound Evie had ever heard. "I was going to come back, you know," she told him. "You were?" "I'd already concluded there's no place for me here. In Cornwall I felt like I fit, for the first time in my life, and even if you weren't ready to marry, I decided I was going to wait and work on you, try to make you fall in love with me." "I've been in love with you ever since you climbed out of your carriage and took over my every thought," he told her. "I'd just had myself completely convinced you could never be happy buried in my little Cornish backwater." "What changed your mind?" she asked, curious. "I realised I'd never actually asked you." He looked a bit sheepish. "And my mother got tired of me moping around and told me very pointedly that not trying made it an absolute certainty I'd never win your heart. She adores you, you know." "And I her." Mrs. Hallidon had finally managed to mollify her irate husband and sent him out to deal with the wedding guests, who were no doubt exploding with curiosity over what they'd just witnessed. Coming to stand in front of Gryff, she looked him up and down, obviously assessing him from his boots and the cut of his coat as a country gentleman of some small means. "You're quite sure, Evadne?" was all she said, however. "Yes, mamma." "Then I suppose I too shall welcome you to the family." "Thank you, ma'am," Gryff said, making a polite bow. "You will have to wait to get married until Sir Eric and Sophie return from Italy, though." "Absolutely not," Sophie said immediately. "I'll be sorry to miss your wedding, but I wouldn't dream of making you wait. Eric and I shall come and see you in Cornwall when we return, and you must come to our estate too." The absolute, unconditional acceptance from her sister meant a great deal to Evie. She hugged Sophie tight, whispering thanks in her ear.
And if you've need of a special licence, Sir Eric said, it just so happens that the Archbishop is a distant cousin of mine. That's very good of you, Gryff said, but I took the liberty of checking with the vicar before I left Swain Cove. Since Evie was resident there for several months, he's happy to call the banns for both of us as soon as I send him the word.
Best send a special messenger today, then, Evie told him, and then they can call the first banns this Sunday, and we can be married in 3 weeks.
But your trousseau, her mother wailed in horror.
We'd have to have it all made in 2 weeks, and it's just not possible. I already own more gowns than I'll ever wear. I don't need anything.
Evie shook her head, never taking her gaze from Gryff's face.
Everything I need is right here, she said softly, and he lifted a large hand to cup her cheek gently.
You are everything to me, he whispered back. Do you think they'll let you run away to Cornwall with me?
Let them try to stop me.
Evie laughed, joy flooding through her.
Tomorrow? Don't wait on my account, Sophie said, obviously shamelessly eavesdropping.
Evie chuckled, turning to give her sister a hug.
I need to pack, and I'd never run out on your wedding party. I think we've caused enough distraction and scandal.
Indeed you have, Mrs. Hallidon said.
Now it's time for some damage control. You may not care if you never show your face in London again, Evadne, but I have to live here. Let's go out there and present your young man to everyone. Put our best feet forward.
Evie glanced sideways at Gryff, wondering how well he'd tolerate the nosy, tonnish crowd. He interpreted her look correctly and squeezed her hand. For you, my love, anything. Lead the way, and I'll do my best to charm them.
Who are you, and what have you done with the grumpy Gryffyn Pascoe I know and love? She whispered teasingly as they followed her mother back to the parlour.
You made me over into a new man, he answered readily. How could I possibly still be grumpy when you were the sunshine?
She laughed softly, and he felt his heart lift at the sound of it, the laughter that came from deep in her soul, that was more beautiful than any music he had ever heard before or since. So lovely it filled him with wonder that such sounds should come from one so small, so vulnerable, yet so strong and vital within her own soul. The rest of the evening passed in surprisingly blissful harmony as Evie's family stepped up and determinedly acted as though he had been courting Evie with their full knowledge and consent all along, for which Gryff was exceedingly grateful. Epilogue. 3 weeks later.
Told you she was the one for you.
Granny Smith nudged Gryff in the ribs with a bony elbow.
I think what you actually said was that I needed to make sure she kept her mouth shut,
Gryff replied dryly, but he never took his gaze from Evie, accepting the congratulations of the well-wishers outside St. Brioc's church.
Well, she's one of us now, isn't she?
Granny nodded approvingly.
I'll not have her caught up in the gentleman's business. My mother did that and paid too high a price for it, Gryff warned. Understood.
Granny looked wise.
Of course, you'll have to convince her of that.
Which would likely be far easier said than done, Gryff thought, as he watched his new wife throw her head back and laugh unabashedly before throwing her arms around Tobias for an enthusiastic hug. He hoped Evie would listen to him. Perhaps she'd listen to Amanda, who had no great love for the gentleman. The Pascoes looked the other way, and he wanted it to stay that way. They took risks enough allowing the cavern beneath the cider house to be used. For certain, the excisemen wouldn't take kindly to it if they knew.
Why the grumpy face?
Evie came up and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm.
Strictly no more grumpy face now we are married, my beloved.
It's impossible to be grumpy around you. It has been from the first moment, though it took me a long time to show it outwardly. He leaned down to kiss her. Just thinking about life. Things we have to navigate. Together. Swain Cove's secrets. She knew him so well. He nodded, saying no more. They are safe with me, always.
As is your heart. I promise. She touched his cheek, her eyes soft and loving. Your mother told me about what happened to her, you know. He hadn't, but he wasn't surprised. Evie and Amanda had become closer than ever since Evie had returned to Swain Cove with him, Evie returning to Pencarrow House only to sleep. I don't want you involved. I'm not. What I told you in the cave that day was true. We look the other way. I understand. I'm not about to take any risks, I promise. Smuggling sounds terribly exciting in theory, but the practice... She wrinkled her nose. I think I'd rather help with the sheep. You won't say that once lambing starts in earnest. He squeezed her hand and began to walk with her back to the carriage, where his mother was already being carefully lifted inside. Lambs are adorable, though. Less so when you have to put your hand inside the sheep to get the lamb out, he teased. Ew! Her squeal of distaste was followed by laughter, though, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. For you, I'll even try that. I think you're likely to be better at bottle-feeding the orphans. He lifted her up into the carriage and climbed in beside her. Leave the whole inside the sheep part to me. So gallant! Evie clutched her hands to her heart and pretended to swoon. Isn't he, Amanda? I have not the faintest idea what the two of you are talking about, but you must know that you have Griff securely wrapped around your little finger, Evie, Amanda said, chuckling at their antics. I don't know about that. I'm the one who's honestly considering putting my hand inside a sheep's nethers, which can only be explained by the fact that I'm quite hopelessly in love with him. Griff was laughing. He couldn't help himself. Evie's teasing, her joy and her zest for life, was contagious. I will be forever grateful that you looked at me and saw a challenge, he murmured in her ear as the carriage set off, carrying them away from the well-wishers who had gathered at the church to see them married, and back to Garth Avalon, where they would celebrate with a slightly smaller crowd. I just wanted to see how handsome you were when you smiled. She put her hand to his cheek again, her fingers lightly stroking. Even more handsome than I ever imagined. You mustn't ever forget how to smile again. As long as I have you. He took her hand in his and kissed the tips of her fingers. I never will. Thank you for listening to The Wassail Wager by Catherine Bilson. Narrated by the author. Copyright 2022. Audiobook production copyright 2023. For more books by the author, visit catherinebilson.com. Thank you for listening to The Wassail Wager, a Regency Christmas romance. Written and narrated by Catherine Bilson. Copyright 2022. Audiobook production copyright 2023. For more books by the author, visit her website at catherinebilson.com.